all good. The new and improved episode 2. So this time we've chosen this topic by popular vote. We had a bunch of different potential philosophers that we can use, and this is mainly meant to be an overview of philosophy for laypersons, so people who are not already PhDs and stuff in philosophy. We're not trying to talk on that level. This is more of getting the big picture of what's going on, where these ideas are coming from, and how they've influenced human culture and history and that kind of thing. So you've chosen Lao Tse for episode number 2, and you can take it away.
Want to start by saying that choosing Lao Tse is a really great choice. It's really easy for me to prepare since there's only one book. And the Tao Te Ching is probably the second most translated book after the Bible. So it's some really great literature. And I wanted to say that as we're kind of exploring these different topics of philosophy, I also want to do different approaches on how to talk about it. And since Lao Tse is pretty straightforward, there's one book, there's one big concept or two, maybe three concepts that are all intertwined, we'll be really going heavy on the text itself this time to really go through some of the different verses of the Tao Te Ching and trying to understand what the way is and why we should not care what the way is, because we never understand it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to start by just talking a little bit about philosophy itself and why reading something like the Tao Te Ching is important to a lot of people, and probably more people should read it. There's a lot of metaphors in it, and you never really know whether or not Lao Tse was speaking in a metaphor or if the metaphor is the concept and vice versa. So it's not something that's meant to be understood. It's something that just it should challenge how you think and how you look at the world. Mm-hmm. So Taoism itself is considered a religion. I think that's somewhat wrong to think of it as a religion. It's more a guideline and a set of fundamental beliefs.
You can call it an ideology.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, but what you were saying about how it's not meant to be directly understood, it reminds me some of the Buddha's teachings, where there's the direct answer to a question and a provisional answer. And a provisional answer is one that ends up leading the student in the right direction, but isn't necessarily something that just solves the question as soon as they ask it. It sends them more onto a journey. So it seems like this is a similar thing, where it's not meant to be just a straight up build order for this is how you live your life. It is intentionally sort of vague, but it's provocative in a way that gets people thinking along the correct lines so they can make some forward progress for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then I wanted to say that when you're reading something like the Tao Te Ching, it's something you can go over as you would with a normal book, just reading it once and maybe getting an idea from what it means and what it's trying to tell you. I think that's the wrong way to approach it. And I found that whenever I prepared for something like this lecture, or just basically to talk about a subject like this, you need to read it over and over again. You sometimes even write it down to show it on stream in this example, but really getting into the thick of it and wrapping your head around it to get to know the concept rather than just reading it. I think that's really important, especially for something as dense as understanding the Tao.
Sweet, we did just get a Up a Tree Zelda host. We're just starting a philosophy discussion on Lao Tse, so feel free to engage in the chat. I will be reading the chat through this, so if you want to ask a question or something and it's appropriate, you can be linked into what's going on. This is meant to be more of a conversation. Pretty relaxed format. This is for laypersons, not for experts. And if you do happen to have expertise in philosophy and you want to correct us or weigh in, you may feel free to do so. But just please be respectful. Looking at you, Sigurd. All right, go ahead.
I think a usual disclaimer, I'm not an expert in what I'm talking about. I'm well read in these topics and I'll try to represent that knowledge as best as I can. If you have any corrections, I'm happy to hear them. Also, I don't know any Chinese, so maybe that's important to know for people. I didn't do my own translation. I've read a bunch of different translations of the Tao Te Ching, and we get a bit into that, why that is and why it's important to look at different sources to get a full picture. Yeah, but basically I don't know any Chinese, so I'll be just quoting what other people said that they, or Lao Tse wrote. And I want to start off by taking us back into the philosophy of mind and talking about consciousness to set the stage on why a ideology can be important in your life and why it's good to have different ideologies to pick and choose, basically. And there was a Portuguese neuroscientist. His name is Antonio Damasio. And he talked about a bunch of different stuff, but the part I want to pick out is he talked about consciousness in three parts. And those parts are being of a timely nature. Basically, he talked about consciousness in the present, which is who we are and how we like all the sensory input we're getting, that is the moment. And then he talks about the past, like everything we've already learned, all the ideologies that are kind of inert to us that informs our view of the present. And the third part being our anticipated future, like who we want to be or where we want to get to or what we see in the future for ourselves or for society, for the planet, whatever. That be the third part. And this might be a bit of a simplistic concept when talking about consciousness, but I think it has some really informative parts to it where you learn something new in the moment. It gets into your past and informs you about the future or how to look at the future.
Yeah, and one important note here too is that none of these processes are perfect. Like all three of them, the way that the mind processes your memories, those memories can be altered and they can be changed over time to be incorrect. They could have been incorrect at the point where you formed the memory. Your current experience also is sort of the best picture your brain can put together at the time, which also probably has some flaws in it. And then our expectations are based on partial information, so this isn't a perfect process. I think there were some thinkers who put introspection on a little bit of a pedestal and that it was one of the most pure forms of thought and consideration, where in the previous segment we talked about how the brain is an evolved organ that was adapted to survive as a hunter-gatherer in the wilderness, which is not the ultimate reasoning machine, you could say. But yeah, breaking it down into those different elements of consciousness, I think, is a useful starting point, for sure.
Yeah, and as you said, all those interpretations that our mind does, they are not perfect. And so there's this difference between reality and our perception of it. And when we talk about the way Tao, the way it can be translated would be reality itself. So the way is whatever is happening. And I think that's a good distinction. It's not something that necessarily has a set forth direction. I think it's not something that goes against free will per se, but it is just what is. That is the way. It's a bit complicated, but I think I'll do my best to give you a sense of what that means and why we're just looking at the way everything we're seeing is just looking at the way unfolding, basically.
And for those who are not familiar with the use of this, the way is usually written with a capital W, meaning that it's sort of a sacred thing like truth with a capital T. And this is, like you were saying, it's sort of a religion, and the way is a broader concept that is beyond just the word way. It is a way that you're, I'm guessing, going to flesh out here in greater detail over the course of this discussion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the goal we're setting out to do when we're talking about the Tao Te Ching, is to get a sense of what the way is. On the other hand, it's something that you should feel. It's not something that you should be able to describe. So what Lao Tse did was basically against the way itself, since the way is not meant to be spoken, which is, yeah, it makes it a bit weird for him to set out all those teachings and talking about how the way is something to be felt and you should not speak it, while he's going on for lengths about what it is. So keep that in mind, that it's basically he's going against his own teachings when he wrote this.
Do as I say, not as I do.
And one other thing I wrote down for the kind of setting up the stage is the notion of coming of age. And it's something that, from my understanding, is a lot more prevalent in the US, maybe in English culture for the most part, as it is in German culture, for example. And I think it's definitely not common in any Eastern culture I know of. And coming of age being this notion that there is this one thing that needs to happen and then you're of age, which is usually a arbitrary barrier of time passed in your life, like you're coming of age at 18 or at 21. But it's also this notion of there's this one thing that needs to be happening for me to be complete. Like, I just want to get this job, or I just want to get married, or find a girlfriend for that matter. I just want to have a child or buy a house. So this notion of there's just this one thing I need to be complete. It's the notion of coming of age. And that's something that's heavily challenged within both a lot of German literature as well as probably all of Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, the way that I hear it phrased a lot is people will say it less so in the terminology of coming of age and more so, once I get this thing, then I'll be happy. And they think of their happiness and their contentment with life as being objective oriented, where they're not allowing themselves to be happy until they get a certain landmark achievement. Like, once I find my partner, then I'll be happy, or like you're saying, once I get a house. All these different examples, which I think is really problematic for finding contentment in the present moment, because you're always going to have certain things that you might like to add into your experience, but you can't have everything that you would desire in every moment. So you have to be able to actualize and kind of find peace in a situation where there is stuff that you might still want, but you can still appreciate where you currently are and enjoy that process.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. And I want to talk briefly about Chinese literature or Chinese language to kind of set up the stage, and then start off by going into some niche because it's always nice to talk about niche. Yeah, so Chinese literature and the Chinese language. As I said on the last stream, it's amazing that if you know traditional Chinese, you'd still be able to read what was written 2,500 years ago. So it's still this same basic language, but also a lot of it gets lost. So, as we have nowadays, as we will always have, words have different connotations and different ways to represent them that are based on the current language, based on current the state of the world, basically. And so when we're translating something now that is 2,500 years old, we understand the words that they were using, but we don't necessarily understand the connotations they were using it with. But as for the Tao Te Ching, it's really heavy when it comes to the terms used. But since a lot of it got lost in translation, it's not important to look at it and dissect different words and why he's using it. It's always about painting this big picture on what he's trying to tell, going back and forth between metaphors and the meanings he's trying to convey.
Yeah, that is a bit of a commentary on language in general and that it evolves over time to fit the needs of the population. Like, even a given word can change in its definition. It's not like a massive change, but it's more of a glacial shift where from generation to generation, if they're using it in slightly different ways, then the meaning changes. So, like you're saying, if you're looking at it word by word and you're hooking on the modern definitions of different words too much, you're kind of missing the point about what the document is about. Which, like you're saying, his style is intentionally vague, so I don't think it was meant to be picked apart by the building blocks of the language.
Yeah, exactly. Also, what I want to say about this is that for me, it was a really great experience to start reading translations in English rather than in German. Because if you read them in a foreign language, you're a lot less likely to think you know what the word means. You're a lot more likely to look up a specific word and see what the different connotations could be now or back then. So I think that's a good example for how looking both at it from a critical point of view, where you try to understand the word they were using and why they're using the word, can be important. And also looking at different translations of a text to see how different people translated a given phrase or saying.
Yep. It's kind of like finding mutually supporting evidence and also kind of stacking the evidence on top of itself and seeing what the average of that is. The same thing can be applied with the Bible as well. Like you're saying, it's one of the most translated documents, so there are obviously a bunch of different translations, and the original idea is probably going to be captured in part by a lot of the different translations, but any given translation is going to be flawed, and it's not going to perfectly represent how it originally existed.
Yeah. Egoistically told me about this quote by Goethe. He said that if you not at least know two languages, you don't know any language at all. So how knowing a different mindset around the language and how translating it back and forth, what happens when translating stuff back and forth, gives you a sense of the language you normally talk and think in, and that's a great experience. That's why everyone should know at least a bit of a foreign language, in my opinion. Yeah, so think we're gonna start out by talking a bit about Zarathustra. Zarathustra being Nietzsche's main work, and I think in the late the late 1900s, that's when a lot of Eastern philosophy got back into the Western mindset, back into Western philosophy, basically. So a lot of these thinkers were, to some degree, influenced by ideas like Taoism, like Confucius. And in Fastbook Zarathustra, there's this beautiful story about Zarathustra going up a pathway. He had a troll on his back at the time, and the troll was mocking him, telling him everything he did wrong, and basically was weighing him down. So as Zarathustra was walking up this path, he stepped into a doorway, and he looked up to the doorway and says to the troll, "Look, where we're standing. This doorway, it says moment. So it's the time we're in right now." And he starts to argue with the moment that both paths, the one he came from and the one he's going, they're both endless. So it's basically all time unfolding, but wherever we're standing, it's the moment. So basically going back to the notion of the three parts of consciousness. So he starts arguing with the troll because the troll was weighing him down, and says, "Well, now that we're in the moment, I might as well get rid of you." And so that's what we'll be talking about when we're talking about Lao Tse and the Tao Te Ching, is getting rid of some notions that are fundamentally not helpful in life. So as Zarathustra got rid of the troll, we're trying to get rid of thinking that the world is mean and has no purpose, to going towards just having a basic happy outlook on life.
And we were talking about having the troll on his back telling him everything he was doing wrong. I was like, oh my god. I live that life. That's awesome. No, but the point of a criticism versus a lot of comments that are inherently unhelpful, I think is an important distinction to make, because if you can get advice and you can integrate that can be really good. But there's also a point where some of it will just wear you down to the point where it's not physically helping you. It's more of just entertainment for the troll or the critic themselves rather than the actual benefit to you, the person. And if the delivery is bad, yeah, it's gonna weigh you down quite a bit. So being able to cut out the negative noise that's impacting your livelihood is really important. This applies to news as well, not just when people are trying to talk to you directly, but the whirlwind of drama that's occurring in the world and how much you should expose yourself to that stuff unfolding.
Yeah, I think that we getting rid of trolls, not just in Twitch chat, but basically the things that are weighing us down is something that's really difficult to do. But as you learn more about how you could look at the world, I think it's easier to get rid of some of the trolls that are stabbing you in the back all the time. Yeah, so I want to start off by talking a bit about the biography of Lao Tse. And important thing to know here is that there's a lot of different sources and they disagree with each other. So we're not 100% sure whether or not Lao Tse existed. Likelihood is that he did exist, but not in any way that it's currently represented. So Lao Tse lived roughly around 6 to 400 BC, depending on what source you look up. So the Wikipedia page says it was 600 BC. Other quoted that he was a contemporary to Confucius, which would have been 200 years later, and is not very likely because in Confucius' writing there's a lot of Taoist notions that go into that, so it's unlikely that they lived at the same time. So we'll just talking about him as he was 200 years before Confucius. And so if that's correct, he lived during the Sui dynasty. And I linked a picture to that. Maybe 2 or 3, not sure.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, number 2. So the Sui dynasty was one of the bigger and longer dynasties in China. So this was a relatively peaceful time. And after the Sui dynasty started the Warring States period, where there was so much infighting that they did like 500 different Dynasty Warrior games about it.
I played some of those. They're pretty fun.
Yeah, they are fun. Oh yeah, I've set up all the pictures, so you should just be able to put them on your overlay and they should fit perfectly, like between chat and your head.
Burp, burp. Let's see. I can just add one of them. Let's put the map. The map. Okay. Boop, boop. There you go. It's a map. Boom. Sweet. Now we have a visual aid.
Yeah, so Lao Tse was a scribe during the Sui period, and he basically we don't know a lot about him for the occasional stories that he told, but the story goes as this, that he was basically living out his life as a scribe, and at some point he got tired of the Sui dynasty and decided to leave. And he left for the West, and this was when he was 70 years old. And the story goes that when he came to the border of the Sui dynasty at the time, that there was this basically a border agent that asked him, well, before you go, would you mind writing down everything you know so we can keep it in here when you're gone? And that's how the Tao Te Ching came to happen, basically. Or that's the story that's told about it.
That seems like a rather taxing task for someone just leaving the country. Imagining that happen, going through the TSA. Okay, take off your shoes, take out your laptop. Okay, write down everything you know. Wait, what?
Yeah, that's...
So I'm seeing a little bit of overlap here, and the chat is pointing this out too. He's kind of a legendary figure, and we talked about this in the previous session about Ragnar Lothbrok, where there are a bunch of different things that point to this character, but there isn't as much direct physical evidence as for later characters. But it seems like there was something going on there, and it was definitely a major impact of this person. So maybe it's a compound character, maybe it's someone whose story was played up a little bit, that kind of thing. So it is the realm of legend.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the story getting pushed a bit, so there's legend that he, after going west, so there's nothing... We don't know what happened to him afterwards. So there's stories that he became the teacher of Siddhartha Gautama, so basically being the teacher of Buddha. Other sources say that he was Siddhartha Gautama himself. So there's a lot of legend around him, and we'll be be going into how the philosophy of Buddhism and Taoism are closely linked. So there is somewhat merit to that. On the other hand, it's not very likely that he just learned a completely different language and started to bring a new version of his own teaching. But yeah, Lao Tse is definitely a more of a mythos than a real person. But the text itself, the Tao Te Ching, is it's factual. We have sources of it going. This was found in 1993. We found the oldest translation of, or not translation, the oldest version of the Tao Te Ching. And
I think you gave me an image of that original text.
yeah, exactly.
Got it.
So this was found in 1993, so it's fairly recent, and they did some carbon dating on it to find out how old it is. So this text was roughly between 600 and 200 BC. And it's the original verse of the Tao Te Ching, which is a 81 verse. I think it's more poetry than a
Than prose.
Than prose, exactly.
Yeah, that it kind of lines up with Proverbs of the Bible, where it was written more as poetry rather than just a person speaking about the different principles.
Yeah, so I think as there's not much know about his life, what he did, and we're unsure about what that means and how to interpret that, I think we shouldn't spend too much time on it, but rather go into what his philosophy meant in the big context. And there's picture number 4, the vinegar tasters. So this is the perfect example of what was happening and how to look at Lao Tse's philosophy.
They're tasting vinegar?
They're tasting vinegar.
Straight up?
So we... I'm not sure. I hope not. I wouldn't do it. So there's 3 people in this picture. It's Lao Tse, it's Confucius, and it's Buddha, basically. And the story goes as this, that I think it's pretty hard to tell on this picture, but the story goes that they all tried the vinegar, and Confucius had a bitter facial expression, and Buddha had a salty facial expression, and Lao Tse was just happy. And this kind of informs about their worldview. So while Confucius thought that life is something that needs to be directed in the right way for people to live a good life. So he was bitter about people doing the wrong thing, and so he needed to set out the guidelines. And Buddha basically argued that all of life is suffering, and that we try to make the best out of that. And Lao Tse was just thinking, well, life just is. Life is good. And we ought to be happy about it. That's the one interpretation. And the other interpretation is that while they're all tasting from the same barrel of vinegar, is that all these 3 philosophies are basically one and the same. And there's 3 different people looking at it differently.
I'm seeing an overlap here between 3 guys walking to a bar. It seems kind of similar. We're using a situation where they're all engaging in the same circumstance and responding to it differently to talk about their characters, but also them being together, like you're saying. is also a point of connection between the three.
Yeah, exactly. Although I hope you get something better than vinegar when
When you go to the bar, yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically his philosophy. His philosophy was that life is good, life is what it's meant to be, and everything is unfolding according to plan. So that's the Tao Te Ching. And I think we need to basically translate the title. So Tao, as we already said, is the way with a capital W. So it's the way, not just a way. And Te is basically the way unfolding. So Te being the active, what's happening when Tao is put into practice.
It's the process
And
of the way.
exactly. And Ching just basically means great book. So the Tao Te Ching is the great book of the way and its teachings.
And its flowing process, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so understanding the way and what it means to be on the way is best exemplified through the concept of Wu Wei. And there's this beautiful story about it, which dates a lot later than the actual Taoist scripts, but I think it's a good story to exemplify on what the way is and what it is. So basically, there's a group of people standing in an alleyway, and they want to get along the alleyway, but there's an ox standing in their way, and I have a picture of that, number 6. So there's this ox standing in the alleyway, and the people start to argue on how to get past the ox. So they start to do different approaches. There's a strong man showing up, and he tries to pull the ox out of the alleyway to get across it or to get past him. And he gets some horns, and it doesn't work out. And there's this artist that tries to jump across the ox and push it from the back, and that's not working either. So they just stand there and contemplate how to manage this whole ox business. So there's this Taoist master that shows up. So they go, "Master, please, we have this problem. Show us how we get past the ox." So the Taoist master comes to the alleyway, looks at the ox, walks past it to the next alleyway, and is gone. What is there to learn from this? Basically, the way that is blocked with an ox is not the way.
So it's a little bit like Path of Least Resistance.
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to, rather than contest objects in your way, find a solution around them.
Yeah, there's a lot of water imagery in the Tao Te Ching, where it's similar to water running down a slope, where it's just taking the way it's taking. It's not thinking about whether it wants to go left or right. It's just flowing down and keeps flowing down, whatever it does.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good way of exemplifying the Tao Te Ching.
A lot of my exposure to this, especially Wu Wei, is from Bruce Lee. He has a whole chapter on that in his book Striking Thoughts, and he talks about Wu Wei as natural movement, which is, he invokes water a whole bunch as well. You can see there's a very major influence there, but he talks about that in the context of fighting, where it shouldn't be a very structured, scripted progression of you're doing particular moves. It should be a flowing process that represents your body naturally and responds to your opponent's body naturally in a way that isn't providing a ton of direct resistance. It's finding those opportunities and capitalizing on those.
Yeah, and I think especially in fighting, there's a lot of I think basically not having to think about your action but letting them flow naturally is really important, because if you think too hard, you get punched.
Yeah, I notice
And
this
it,
whenever I do my mouse accuracy at the start of the day, where it's just clicking a bunch of bubbles that are coming up. And if I notice myself thinking in words about stuff that I have to do or the drama that's going on and things like that, my accuracy tends to go down. I tend to do the best when I'm not thinking in words and I'm just seeing and letting my hand take care of everything. Because a lot of thought, like we talked about in the previous discussion, it doesn't necessarily need words to have value. Like you can be conscious and you can be acting in a way that your brain is doing the work, but it doesn't necessarily need to go through your language process to get to some outcome.
yeah, language is slowing us down a lot. If we have to think about stuff in terms of language, it stops the natural flow downhill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think now that we know that we should not try to get past the ox, but just go another way, I think I want to go into some of the scripture of the Tao Te Ching and see the beauty of the text and the notions he's using to describe it. And I'll be using the Jonathan Star translation, which is one of the newer translations. And it's not as literal a translation, it's more so for the casual reader. But it's a really beautiful translation. It invokes all these images, and you really get a sense of the thinking rather than the terms they were using to describe it, which I think is a really beautiful version of translating it. Yeah, so we're starting out with verse 1, and I tried to kind of sort them in a logical manner, which was weird, so I just decided I'm doing them by how they show up numerically. Yeah, so verse 1 of the Tao Te Ching. The way that can be walked is not the way. A name that can be named is not the name. Oh yeah, by the way, I put all of these in text for you as well, so you can add them so people can read along. Because only hearing it is not as powerful as reading it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And reading it yourself is not as powerful as writing it down or just having it on mind for a couple of days.
I have the text here. I could.
You should just be able to add it like an image as well.
Put it in the philosophy folder. Script. Let's see. Well, let me do it this way. What I can do is text. It's not letting me add that as text.
There's a couple of PNG files you could just add, like you did the picture of Lao Tse.
Okay, look in that Dropbox. Please stand by. Oh, is this the V1, V2?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's verse. Okay, I got it. Oh, these are... You did white text. I thought these were a bunch of empty pages. It's like, what are all these... It's the invisible way. Oh man, this is
Exactly.
a spiritual part of the process, actually. Just because you can't see the text doesn't mean it isn't there.
The way that is not visible is the way. I think that's a good way to represent it. I thought it was easiest to read on your background if it's white.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm gonna download these. Verses 1, verse 2. And yeah. I believe I do have the Tao Te Ching. I'm kind of curious as to what version I have. But I know I have a version. And I did read it at some point. I did skim some of the verses that you sent to me, and one of the aspects that stood out that I feel like is more valuable than ever is the concept of stillness having value.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a streamer, I definitely feel like this is one of the disciplines with the least amount of stillness a person could possibly have. So when I do get some time away, there is that desire to, maybe I should do an IRL stream, maybe I should work on content and stuff. But just having some time to sit down and listen in a way that you're not hassling with a bunch of different things goes a super long way. And I feel like it's better to sacrifice some of that uptime just for a refresh, to listen to the trees and the sounds around you and stuff. Okay, I got all those files. We're going to copy it. We're going to paste it. We're making the magic happen. We're doing it live. So good job with all this stuff. These resources, I think, help a lot to flesh out the experience. People love visual aids. I know, because I love visual aids. First one, boom.
There's an interesting thing about reading, the difference between reading something yourself and hearing someone talk about it. Whenever you're reading something yourself, you're hearing it in your voice, basically. So it simulates your own thinking. So you think that you were the one thinking these things, which is a big difference to just hearing someone else talk about it and think, well, he's talking some nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of beauty in reading, in my opinion, because you get a sense of what and how other people were thinking, and you can still think they were thinking nonsense after the fact that you've read it, but it's a lot more active and you're engaging your brain in different activities than when you're just listening.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so from the top, verse 1. A way that can be walked is not the way. A name that can be named is not the name. Tao is both named and nameless. As nameless, it is the origin of all things. As named, it is the mother of all things. A mind free of thought, merged with itself, beholds the essence of Tao. A mind filled with thought, identified with its own perceptions, beholds the mere form of this world. Tao and this world seem different, but in truth they are one and the same. The only difference is what we call them. How deep and mysterious is this unity? How profound, how great? It is the truth beyond the truth, the hidden within the hidden. It is the path to all wonder, the gate to the essence of everything.
So the way that this resonates with me, and this is kind of speaking to my perspective and what I've learned, is talking about the ego boundary and how the boundary of how we perceive our ego to be as separate from everything else that is sort of a construct that we use, but it's not technically correct in the physiological sense of how the world is. We cannot exist independent from the world. We are fully attached to it. We need the air around us to breathe. We need the water to drink. We need our community to exist as a social species. And this is talking about that sense of oneness where you're not resisting the boundary between yourself and everything else. You're seeing less of a boundary and kind of accepting the whole rather than trying to think about all the individual parts. And for a text like this, like you're saying, because it's so vague, it's almost kind of like you would want to put the words up there, and then rather than just sit there and look at it, you could, this is kind of talking figuratively, get up and walk around it and look at it from different angles. And you could see different things about this text based on the angle of approach. So I took kind of a Western philosophy, like psychology, look at this set of statements. You could look at this also through a more religious lens of you're treating this as religious scripture of your ideology, and you're kind of processing that more like prayer. You could basically break down every line of this and try to figure some stuff about it.
Yeah, it's really heavy in terms of meaning and different things you could read into it. So that's why I really wanted to go into the thick of the book itself, at least for the Lao Tse part, because there's so much beauty within it, but also there's this vagueness about it that really doesn't state, well, this is how it is, but rather this is one way to look at it. Let's not try to think of ourselves as different from the world or from the way, but rather we're just as much part of it as everything else.
Yeah, I did have some experiences that were sort of artificially created like this with psychedelics. It does tend to disrupt that organization. Usually the brain is trying to keep things in different categories just for the sake of organizing your reality, because for a survival standpoint, it is important to understand the difference between your physical body and the bear that is over there. You don't really want to have that sense of oneness of, yes, we're all part of the universe. Yes, but if your part of the universe goes to that part of the universe, you're going to get eaten. So, practically speaking, we do have some value in understanding where one object ends and where the other begins, but that can also work against us as well. And what he's talking about here is, I think we naturally have the tendency to want to categorize, especially like you were saying, with the advent of language and writing. You want to put stuff into bins. Like you talk about this in the Bible, where Adam is naming all the different animals in God's creation, and how we have that desire to put things in categories, put stickers and names on different stuff, which distances us from understanding the oneness that he's talking about.
Yeah, I think it's it's not one or the other. Like we're both separate in some sense, but we're also one. So this notion you talked about, that we need to be able to think about ourselves separate from the rest of existence, basically, was a lot more important back in the days when saber-toothed tigers were an actual threat to us. So I think as we evolved as a species and society evolved to the point where we don't really have to be scared of anything existential coming from nature other than natural disaster, we got more time to see ourselves as being part of this oneness and don't have to separate ourselves or our individuality from existence. So I think this is a way of approaching this where we just, as you said, basically getting a different view, which might not be correct either, but it's just a different way to approach the duality of mind and body, or the duality of humanity versus nature.
I think this would be a really key example of what caused the shift. So in Western thought, we tend to be more individualistic, and in Eastern thought, it's more collectivist. And this kind of document and this sort of talk, I feel like, is a big part of what caused that in the modern era. As if this is such a key document in the East, and they're more collectivist in general, I would guess that these things are linked.
Yeah, these things are definitely linked, and I think that's something we'll be talking about a bit more in depth when we talk about Confucius and also the Maoist movement that kind of was even more collectivist than Confucius was, and how they felt that we should love everyone equally, not just our family and our next of kin. So there's a lot of like all of Eastern philosophy basically boils a lot more down to this sense of we're one and we ought to get along with each other and we ought to build something as a community rather than individuals.
For real. How do you feel about alternating reading these for fun?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was thinking because when I looked it up, trying making looking at how to order them, I noticed that if we alternate them and going through them numerically, it would work out perfectly.
Cool. We got a verse number 2 here. Oh yeah. Okay, let me see. It's a little bit easier for me to read with the script document that you sent me. Because my OBS is shrunk. Alright, let's do verse 2. Everyone recognizes beauty, only because of ugliness. Everyone recognizes virtue, only because of sin. Life and death are born together, difficult and easy, long and short, high and low. All these exist together. Sound and silence blend as one. Before and after arrive as one. The sage acts without action, and teaches without talking. All things flourish around him, and he does not refuse any one of them. He gives, but not to receive. He works, but not for reward. He completes, but not for results. He does nothing for himself in this passing world, so nothing he does ever passes.
Yeah, so this verse talks about the duality of things, that we only um, look at differences because we have the differences. So there's no long if there's no short, there's no high if there's no low, there's no good if there's no bad, and there's no life if there's no death. And this is a probably a notion that is pretty normal in thought. I think we know that this to be true, but it's still interesting to think about it, especially when we go into there's no good if there's no bad, and our own belief system. So if we try to cut out everything bad from our life, we're also cutting out everything good. So we since we're looking at things in those opposites, we can't have just one of them.
I've had this discussion with quite a few people, just on a personal level. I think this is a more general human question that I think people tend to ask. It's not a perfect thing that I would agree with universally, like that you need evil in order to have good. I also think of a neutral point here because it's written in terms of the extremes of long and short. As it's saying all of them exist together, I see it as the spectrum from good to evil, the spectrum from high to low, everything in between. And the personal example that I've given is you don't need evil to understand good, just as you don't need to be punched in the face to enjoy a meal. You can have a positive that is above neutral, but you don't need pain and an evil in order to appreciate that positive. So I think that's part of my active reading, where sometimes you read something and it doesn't fully sit well for you, but the process of seeing how that relates to how you think about it is really fun.
Yeah, I tend to agree that you don't have to have bad in order to understand good, but it makes it a lot easier for us to see something good as good, because we also know that something bad is bad. So, and enjoying a meal in this example would just be something you enjoy, but you wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of good and bad. If there was like, in terms of the meal, there's good meals and there's meal that may be overcooked or a bit too salty. So you still have a notion of if it's better or worse, and we tend to think of things comparing it to other things. And this comparison nature of how our mind works is the point he's trying to make. Not that there's just this two extremes and everything goes in between them.
Yeah.
And then for the second part is talking about the sage, and this is something he does full length all through the book, and this notion of sagehood and how to be the best version you could be is really interesting to me and informed me a lot about how I want to approach my life. Not just from the Tao Te Ching, also how Plato, for example, talked about similar notions, or how Confucius approached this subject, where you're trying to do without doing, to teach through actions more so than through talking, but also not trying to make everything a teaching moment, but just to live a life that could be used as an example, and not trying to make a point by doing it.
If I can vent for a second about one of our modern problems that this speaks directly to, it is the profession of I'm a nice guy or I'm a good person as something that is asserted rather than acted. A truly nice person with kindness and grace and compassion and tact represents that by their actions, and it becomes understood by the community just through that process, rather than that you reach to your wallet and you pull out the I'm a nice person card. Some people think of goodness and niceness as something that you either have or don't have, rather than the way I've described it is it's a daily challenge. You have to make the choice to take the action of virtue and goodness, which oftentimes requires effort and sacrifice, or preventing yourself from doing something that would be negative. And you have to keep working at it day after day. And it's also not just the binary of either you're good or you're bad. It's if you're good, you can still be better. You can still challenge yourself to improve upon that aspect of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some things nowadays that we don't have a concept of anymore, like he works but not for reward. I think that's really alien, especially for Western culture. I think we're almost doing everything for a reward. And not saying this is necessarily wrong, but being able to know that you could work without seeking reward for it is a nice concept that we should have at least a bit of a sense of in Western culture.
Yeah, that jumps out at me with the constant struggle as a broadcaster between trying to grow but also trying to be true, and how oftentimes having a growth mindset where you're looking for the reward and the increase ends up crippling you, because you're never going to be growing as fast as you can imagine, and there's always going to be other horses in the race that are ahead of you. And if you're looking at that process, you're distracting yourself from the way, if we want to use this as in the text, which is representing yourself as well as you can and making the best content that you can, that you love. So just loving what you're doing, and how that creates a natural point of attraction to your content and your brand, because you're just loving every minute of what's going on, and that's infectious to those around you, rather than trying to reach for every dollar you physically can, which is more of a byproduct of the process rather than the foundation of the process.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think that it's really important for any streamer to enjoy what they're doing in order to be good at it. So doing what you love makes it easier to do a good job. And for your example, like trying to diversify and do other stuff than just lettering in StarCraft will make you a better streamer just by virtue of you being happier about the things you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the last sentence here is about the eternal nature of Tao and how if you're giving yourself to it, you might not be remembered, and nothing you do matters, but you're one with the way, and that's the important goal in life,
Yeah,
at least from the Taoist understanding.
it reminds me of the phrase, you want to leave the room better than you found it. If you're going to be a steward, basically we're all stewards of a human vessel throughout our lives, and our tenure is incomplete. And ideally, every person tries to shape situations in a way that just leave the next generation a little bit better off than the previous one. There are lots of people, historically speaking, who have made massive improvements upon the world, and we benefit from those on a daily basis. And that's one of the beautiful aspects of what we can do in life that isn't necessarily attached to a name, but it's more of that general human effort to leave the future better than the past.
Yeah, the way is constantly unfolding, and we're going in a good direction. Steven Pinker described in the Better Angels of Our Nature, like there's some kind of direction we're going. It doesn't seem to be getting worse. It seems to be getting better over time. Although we ever so often slip from the path and do something rather stupid along the way.
Yeah, that's a book that I haven't finished yet, but I think about halfway into it. And a point of confusion for our generation is the evils of the world are better reported and recorded than before. So it can seem like the world is worse than it was in the past, but if you look at the data of the relative danger to humans who are living, it's safer than ever before per capita on average. Even though we can see high definition videos of bad stuff happening that's put all over the internet. So it can be a little bit deceptive in that capacity, but we are moving forward and making progress.
Yeah. I think one of the best examples he used was basically how England had a big influence on violence within culture, how English culture is kind of this predecessor of European culture, and how that evolved into the Americas nowadays. And the example he used was that I don't know how many years ago that was, let's say towards the end of the Middle Ages. When you went into a restaurant or a bar, you were not allowed to bring a knife because stabbing people was something that happened all too often. So when you went into a restaurant and you were not allowed to bring a knife, you had these knives that were chained to the table, so you were not able to stab the person sitting across from you.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how close you were sitting, you were probably able sitting next to you in the leg or something, but you were not able to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And how this notion kind of people stopped bringing knives, so people stopped carrying knives all the time, and at some point they were able to get rid of the chains and people were still not stabbing each other. So basically that all of this is a development that's happening over time, and we tend to get better given the right circumstances.
Yeah, the shift that he talks about in the text is one of etiquette and cultural norms, where certain activities are seen initially as acts of honor, like challenging someone to a duel. Ooh, that's an honorable activity. Look at him standing up for himself. To generations pass, and it begins to look more and more barbaric and savage. And the people who are doing that are seen more as mad bandits, sort of, rather than as paragons of virtue, to the point where, like you're talking about knife etiquette. One thing that I noticed about etiquette in France is you're generally supposed to have your hands visible whenever you're sitting at a dinner table, even having your thumbs just visible on the table itself, so that you couldn't cock a weapon, like a gun or whatnot. So seeing that general shift of violence being seen as less and less acceptable in standard social interaction, not just that it's morally wrong, but that it's gross and uncool, and people see it as nasty and undesirable. And that was a very, very long and slow shift over the course of human history, which is sort of tied with the increase in quality of life. So as our quality of life has gone up, our desire to maintain that and live a safe and good life increases as well, which makes us less risk-seeking and more risk-averse.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
I don't want to fight you to the death, because we'll probably live until we're 80, and I would rather be comfortable and hanging out on a beach somewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's more so the focus on the good side of things. Basically, wanting to be able to spend more good times becomes more important than getting revenge for something the other person did to you, because you tend to realize that maybe you feel it's worth getting revenge for it, but also the risk of that being big, and you might lose out on half a lifetime of hanging out at the beach, getting drunk, or tasting vinegar with people.
This vinegar is too bitter. This vinegar is too salty. This vinegar is just right.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do verse 6.
Let's do it.
Why people should shut the fuck up every so often.
All right, hang on. I'm going to switch it. Dude. Verse number 16. And we're good.
Verse 16. Become totally empty. Quiet the restlessness of the mind. Only then will you witness everything, unfolding from emptiness. See all things flourish and dance in endless variation. And once again merge back into perfect emptiness. Their true power repose. Their true nature. Emerging, flourishing, dissolving back again. This is the internal process of return. To know this process brings enlightenment. To miss this process brings disaster. Be still. Stillness reveals the secret of eternity. Eternity embraces the all-possible. The all-possible leads to a vision of oneness. A vision of oneness brings about universal love. Universal love supports the great truth of nature. The great truth of nature is Tao. Whoever knows this truth lives forever. The body may perish, deeds may be forgotten, but he who has Tao has all eternity.
This seems very Yoda in the structure of it, because it's one thing leading to another down a chain that takes you somewhere, which is an interesting structure. And with this one, talking about the stillness, and it's sort of a circle of life kind of a picture it's talking about, where it's all part of the chain, and if you realize you're a part of that circle, then there's less despair, I guess, in it being temporary for you as an individual. But the be totally empty is, I'll say, a massive challenge. Personally speaking, to sit down and to not have your mental chatter running really fast is hard. Like, talking about meditation, a lot of people think of it as kind of a spiritual, like, woo, it needs to be fancy and it's kind of weird, hippie, or whatever. Just in the simple capacity of sitting down, being quiet, not just with your mouth, but also in your mind, and listening, like actively listening to what's around you and being relaxed, is really tough. I challenge you to just sit down and think about how many moments pass by where your chatter is going versus where your chatter quiets down and you can just absorb what's happening around you. It's kind of like its own muscle where there's skill involved in that process of letting go and meditating, where I would probably put my meditation skill level at something like silver or gold, where I know enough about the process to know that I'm a noob, but I also haven't really had those long practice sessions where you're out in nature and you meditate for hours. Well, you don't need to be in nature in particular, but meditating for long periods of time and building those mental muscles and skills to exercise that. It's tough, especially with our standard of having phones going off and tons of tabs open on the computer and Twitch chat rolling and your opponent attacking you. We're used to that fast, 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 having a bunch of different things happening, a booked schedule being really busy. But yeah, being out away from all that and being able to relax and be empty is very refreshing, but also at the same time very difficult to practice.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, I'd say I'm probably not even gold, still hanging around silver level of meditation skills, where I know about the process, but I'm not really able to dive into it or to give it enough time to work on it, basically. And as you said, basically now the sensory overkill has become the new normal. It it is increasingly difficult for us to just shut down input, but also shut down the input we're giving ourselves. Basically, listen to our own thinking. And there's some good ways to practice it, be it through just listening to your own breathing, or to repeat a mantra to fall into meditation. That can work, but it's super difficult. But it's something that is really worth experiencing. And once you just had a couple of brief moments where you can empty your mind and see the you can see the beauty of that, it's a transformative experience, in my opinion, where you just feel like, all right, I should take the time to do this. But it's also, it becomes this where you meditate to a degree of sensory overkill as well, where it's just the opposite of the sensory overkill would be meditation, but you're doing meditation not as a supplement, but also as something within the same realm, which is problematic in my opinion. Where it's just it's a good example for me is walking as an exercise, where a lot of people think of going for a walk means that you have to keep this or that pace. You go for at least half an hour or for at least 10 miles or something. Where walking for me is more like taking the time to put on my shoes, step outside the door, and get my feet moving. And I don't worry about how long it will take me, what I will be thinking about. What it's for the enjoyment of the process, basically.
Yeah, an aspect for me is whenever I put myself in a space where I'm working on meditating and things like that, a lot of times you will have some active thoughts that have been basically pushed just below the surface of your conscious thought while you've been busy with activities and your job and tasks and whatnot. And once you isolate yourself, those come to the surface. I like giving myself a little bit of time to chip away at those a little bit so I can mentally relax some more, rather than to try to push stuff away per se. It's kind of like accepting those waves of thoughts a little bit and letting them say their piece, quiet down. And environmentally speaking, I tend to meditate the best when I have just something outside and I can pay really close attention to the sounds I can hear, where they're coming from, and maybe what they are and what they're doing. So you're listening to birds, you're listening to the rustling of trees, you can hear a car passing by, you can kind of tell how big it is. That kind of stuff where I have a little bit more to focus on with my listening, I'm less likely to jump back into my own head with the words that are passing through.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, where just try not to try, basically, which is, again, the nature of the way. And one other form of meditation that I'm familiar with, that I find interesting to kind of get into the habit of what it means to meditate or have this kind of mindset shift, is we usually do meditation before kendo practice. Kendo being the Japanese form of sword fighting with the wooden sticks.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, you get yourself in the mindset of doing a fight and basically wanting to win, wanting to destroy the enemy without hurting them in this case. But basically, that if I would go to kendo practice within my normal mindset, I'd just be, all right, we're just having fun beating each other with sticks. But for it to be good practice, you need to be in the mindset that you're worried about the other person's sword, you're worried about you winning the fight and you getting out of it victoriously. And that's for me a good kind of practice to just realize that the mind is not something fixed, it's something that is fluid. You can give it different tasks or different inputs and be like, all right, now I'm this warrior and I want to win this fight, which would not be my normal nature. And yeah, so having this kind of meditation, just to setting yourself on or giving yourself a different mindset, can be interesting to just get into the notion of what it means to meditate and to quiet your normal self in order to get into another stage.
Yeah, that works for me with regards to StarCraft play as well. If I get in the warrior mindset, it tends to help me more than a neutral, peaceful mindset, just by virtue of the format of what is happening. So having more of a stance that is forward leaning, where you're ready to take advantages and really press in to an opponent, is very different from a passive active listening. I'm trying to pay attention to the birds around me, because your objective is very different. So like you're saying, meditation doesn't need to just be letting go and the process of relaxing. It can also be meditating as a form of preparation for a certain task. So you need to go into battle, or you need to give a presentation. Say you're in the business world or something, you need to give a speech. Maybe just getting yourself in the right mindset, encouraging yourself, reminding yourself of your objectives, maybe soothing some of your nerves a little bit. Those aspects can go a long way as well. So meditation is a very broad frontier. It's not just one given exercise. And what you were saying before is that meditation shouldn't be lost in the procedure. So sometimes they'll have a certain script of breathe 20 times, say this mantra. If you get too caught in the hand waving, you can kind of miss the point of what it's for. So you shouldn't just think about the different techniques for meditation. You should also find what works for you in the process, rather than what someone else said that you should do.
Yeah, exactly. And also not have a goal on what meditation should be. It should just be the time you take to quiet yourself down a little bit, or to get yourself rallied up, if that's what you need for StarCraft or beating someone else with a stick. I also love how you put this physical notion into it, this forward leaning, which is really important in kendo practice. But it's an interesting notion about how our physical appearance relates to our mental state. So basically, I'll be talking a whole lot different sitting on my couch as I do now, as if I would standing and being a lot more active with my arms when talking. And that's something that's interesting to realize and to play with on how your physical readiness relates to your mental readiness.
Yeah, they've done studies on the ways that people stand and how those impact things like confidence. So there's the Superman pose where you're standing up with your legs kind of shoulder width apart and you have your hands on your hips and you have a very kind of strong, high posture where it looks like you're kind of standing and representing your full size and you're upright and everything, and how that tends to help people mentally. It's just a way of physically holding your body, but since we don't have a hard line between the mind and the rest of the body, the way that we carry ourselves oftentimes affects our mental state.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll beat my chest a little bit too if I'm about to compete or do something like that just to get a little bit hyped up. Confidence goes a super long way just for your momentum and being able to really take initiatives and not doubt yourself. I think self-doubt is really important in life, but there's certain situations where, like, say you're in a competition, you've trained this for quite some time. Second guessing yourself, it takes too much time. You should just go with your training, go with your instincts, and just flow from one move into the other, rather than being unsure of what to do. I noticed this when I was going over my games in the recent Challenger qualifier, where there were periods where I didn't know what to do and I was kind of doubting what my next process was. So being aware of where that self-doubt comes up and understanding how you can build some training to inform your instincts. My calculus teacher in university was saying that your intuition can be developed. So as you learn, as you practice, as you train, your intuition shifts over time to be more and more elegant in the way that it solves problems. Once you get to the test, you're going to need to have some final answer, though. So just develop your intuition with your study, and when you need to perform, trust your instincts and your training for that performance.
Yeah, everything we do is kind of to prepare ourselves for what's to come. With the only thing that we can be certain about that will come be death, which we cannot be prepared for. But we're developing, trying to get better as a moral being, or we're trying to get better at a specific task. So we're constantly working on ourselves, but making it naturally and not trying to force the way is an important concept to keep in mind. And that's where basically meditation can be a really good practice.
Cool, so we up to 33?
Yeah. As I, yeah.
Alright, gotta put it on. And it's my turn. Verse 3.
33.
Yeah. 2 threes in a row. One who knows others is intelligent. One who knows himself is enlightened. One who conquers others is strong. One who conquers himself is all-powerful. One who approaches life with force surely gets something. One who remains content where he is surely gets everything. One who gives himself to his position surely lives long. One who gives himself to Tao surely lives forever. I read this one before we got started, and the film that jumps out at me, and it's one of my favorite movies, Revolver, ends up being a sort of battle between the main protagonist and his own ego throughout the course of it. He thinks that he's in it for revenge, and that's kind of how it begins, but there is this internal dialogue that he's wrestling with, and by conquering his ego, he ends up winning in the story in a sort of weird way. It's a film with a lot of flaws and gaps in it, but that process is one that isn't talked about very much, so for me it's a really refreshing film to watch, where it's not just hero versus villain, it's character versus himself and what's going on within him.
Yeah, I don't know that movie, but I'll have to. Yeah, I think that's the whole. When we started the first philosophy talk, we talked about the philosophy of mind and consciousness, and I think there's an interesting question there of why we want to understand consciousness and how we want to be able to have our own understanding of consciousness to be able to generalize and understand other people's actions, but also understand what we're doing ourselves in the process. So there's this dual nature to it, where we want to understand ourselves, but we want to be able to understand others through the lens we're putting out by just having a conscious understanding of what's happening. And this is the duality he talks about, that it's good to know others, but once you know yourself, you're being able to see others within yourself, not just yourself within others. That's where you get to the point of enlightenment.
Yeah, Angelic in the chat is saying conquering oneself might refer to not being controlled by your own fleeting whims and impulses. Self-control is a part of this as well, where you, as an agent, you experience desires to take certain actions or certain paths, but being able to take a step back from that as the executive in your own mind and saying, this is not good for me in the long term, or this is unwise, and abstaining from certain actions as often being the best course. So it's that balance too, where you do want to flow naturally, but at the same time you want to be aware of the impulses within yourself that could betray your better interests.
Yeah, I think we're. I'm not sure whether or not we really dove into Kahneman's System 1 and 2 when we talked last time. I think we scratched on its surface a tiny bit. Basically, the difference between doing something from intuition, doing it from what we think we ought to react to something, as compared to thinking it through, going through a rational process of, all right, there's a bunch of ways to look at this, and I might not need to punch the other person because he said a mean word to me. Is there are two completely different processes, and I think conquering yourself and this concept would mean to be able to think rationally and to kind of go through the notions of thinking something through when needed, but also to trusting your own instincts and just letting them flow when you feel it's necessary.
Yeah, having this duality for any given example, where you'll have one angle where it says trust your instincts, and then you'll have the other angle which says be wary of the instincts that will betray you. It makes everything really complicated and in a way more interesting, but it's, with the spirit of this document, it's more describing the way and allowing you to think about what's around you rather than telling you what to do. So it's not just a playbook for, this is how you should be an adolescent, this is how you should be a young adult, this is how you should be a middle adult, this is how you should be a merchant. It's intentionally broad and vague and encompassing, to where the person can use it as a sort of map, but not really one that they're going to follow a particular path. It's more showing the landscape of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems that philosophy is facing, that we tend to be rather lazy when it comes to thinking. So we like concepts that are neatly packed up, and we can distinguish between something being good or bad, being small or large. We love to be able to put things into drawers, as we say in German, and just grouping up things and understanding them as a whole rather than individual cases, and seeing that there's just no way to summarize them as a whole, makes thinking really difficult. I think that's not necessarily what our brains were meant to do. So I think that's challenging for a lot of people to have a view of philosophy as not being something that tells you what is right or wrong, but just gives you different angles to look at it and see that, well, it might be neither of those.
All right, we got 43 next.
That would be mine. Verse 43. The most yielding thing in this world will overcome the most rigid. The most empty thing in this world will overcome the most full. From this comes a lesson. Stillness benefits more than action. Silence benefits more than words. Rare indeed are those who are still. Rare indeed are those who are silent. And so I say, rare indeed are those who obtain the bounty of this world.
A quote that comes to mind with regards to this is, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should listen twice as much as you talk. It kind of fits with that.
Yeah. I think there's nothing. I think it's basically the same notion as the last one, or the one before that, where it's about slowing down, about being still and or being silent even, in order to obtain the beauty of the world, and to obtain also the beauty of want to say wisdom rather than knowledge, where it's just it's good as it is. It might not be what I wanted, but it is, and therefore it's good.
Yeah, the distinction between riches and wealth is important to make. So this last line, rare indeed are those who obtain the bounty of this world. I'm guessing bounty in this case is that encompassing beauty and knowledge, rather than the bounty as in the gold coins and the treasure specifically. So
Yeah.
being able to witness the flow of life around you, and the earth and the sky and all this, and relationships between people, and savoring that through your living tenure, rather than specifically saying I want to be a millionaire and that's my bounty.
Yeah, I think that it goes into the notion of not seeking reward for things, but just finding enjoyment in what is. But as soon as you're seeking something, you tend to get disappointed, and this is a lesson that goes into almost everything we do, where it's I see a lot of people that have problems with relationships because of expectations they have, rather than just being able to play into what is. So I think expectations are really stopping us from enjoyment, because we're always judging on whether or not these expectations are met. And I think that's where the Tao as a concept is really important and valuable for me, because I too have expectations about almost everything, and to just realizing that it ought not to be, and there's different ways to look at it, and there's beauty in not having expectations and beauty in just letting the things unfold as they do. Probably more so than having expectations and having them met or having them not met is really important for me, and that's why I love the Tao Te Ching so much, because it teaches me something that um, is not innate to me. It's not a concept uh, that came packed into me growing up in Western culture.
A discussion that jumps out at me for this topic is the way that Slavoj Zizek was talking about desire, and how in our modern consumerist culture we're trained to associate desire with certain brands, certain items, and things like that, and how desire apparently inherently hits its low point whenever you acquire that thing. So I think the example in the documentary I was watching with him was on a Coca-Cola, and how you can desire that, and the point when you have one is when the desire goes away, which I think represents also a problem for how people view romance and partnership, and how if you expect it to be a desire driven relationship all the time, you're inherently going to run into problems, because the more you're around that person, the more satisfied you are with them and the less desire you might feel. So it should be more of a process oriented relationship where it is equitable and beneficial and symbiotic for you and the other person to cohabitate and coexist, rather than specifically expecting you to have that desire as the main foundation point. It can be a point of attraction that gets the ball rolling, but to think that it's always going to be the same is a really big misconception.
Yeah, totally agree with that. It's basically we're really trained to have desires, and modern day consumerism is really good at teaching us how to desire different thing in an abstract way. Basically, buying a car to get freedom, or um, eating a hamburger to get freedom, and where it's just we get away from the concept itself, where there's product based emotions, which is really interesting. I think it's not something that came naturally per se, and it's interesting that we can get these feelings out of it. It's not just the advertisement that sells it to us this way, but also we're really feeling free when we get this new car driving around along an empty road. And there is truth in how we're advertising, which is an interesting concept, that we alienate the feeling so much from the actual feeling, where we can just directly tie it to a product.
It's tricky too. Desire feels good to have, but oftentimes it can really betray your better interests. It's one of those things that you have to manage, that's a pretty big ongoing pain in your life, I think. There's a lot of desirable stuff out there, and the whole marketing industry is basically a way of putting that stuff that we might desire in front of us and being able to pursue our own course. There's stuff in the chat about how desire doesn't create, it consumes, and how if you are only desiring things, you are only consuming things, there isn't anything that's being expressed that is uniquely your own. So being able to have periods in between chasing the desire and considering something that you want to build, some way that you want to express yourself, is a really important thing to bring into that dynamic. We can't really divorce ourselves from desire. I think there are some philosophers and thinkers who, we'll probably talk about more of them, where they talk about reducing your desires entirely or as much as you can, which seems a little bit extreme. But we definitely feed into the desire machine a little bit more than is good for us, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. An interesting example there would be Epicurus, which I hope gets more votes on the next straw poll. And he talks about understanding desire and thinking through desire in a way where you realize that it's it's not good or bad to have desire, but to understand the desire is important, and to know how to make the best out of that desire. Because the example he used, sleeping with your neighbor's wife might be a desirable thing to do, and it might be pleasurable while doing it, but there's a lot of things that could go wrong with that, and there's a lot of pain that could be caused by that. So maybe sleeping with your neighbor's wife is not the perfect action to do. So you have to look at the desire not only on what you want, but also what the implications are. And he goes into a lot of really nice examples, talking about how we're basically cheating ourselves and our own thinking when we just have a desire and follow through with it, rather than thinking it through and looking at the implication that it's having.
Yep, you get the consequences of your actions as well. Usually the desire doesn't involve those. A lot of risk-seeking behavior, I think, involves that as well, especially for young men, which I think is the most risk-seeking demographic there is. Drive fast to just do a bunch of stupid stuff. What could possibly go wrong? Because you're thinking about the immediate payoff rather than the long-term consequence. To go back to the soda example from before, you think about the desire of how the beverage tastes, but you don't really think about the health profile of the beverage when you have that desire. Of this is a liquid payload of sugar and carbonation that isn't going to help me too much in my path of physical fitness. It's going to actually work to the detriment of that, so I'm weighing the benefits of how good this tastes against the detriments of how this affects my health.
Yeah. I think handling testosterone is a difficult thing to do, and something that helps us thinking through our actions. So young men, like when you start having those testosterone, like an overflow in order to prepare your body to be an adult, that's really difficult to handle, and there's a lot of weird behavior that comes out of that.
I drove a lot faster in my late teens and early 20s. I would pretty much always speed well above the limit and weave through traffic just because I liked going fast and I wanted to go from place to place really fast. And then after driving across the country from Texas to Vancouver, Canada, and seeing that slow process of you're going to get there and savoring the journey is really nice, especially if you can relax through it. I tend to just not choose to go fast as often, which is probably also linked with not having as much testosterone as when I was in that age range. But yeah, it's a different way of interacting with the road now than when I was younger.
Interestingly enough, it's different for me. I used to not like driving for the most part. It took me a long time to get my driver's license, and hesitant to go out on the road, so I was never a fast driver. But now that I live up in the Alps and all the roads are basically this semi-rally driveway where you can just enjoy driving, an experience where you're not necessarily going over the speed limit, but you're driving fast in a fun way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be a ever since that I drive a lot more joyful, not necessarily to the enjoyment of my wife.
Yeah, having the way that you operate a vehicle with yourself versus with a passenger is pretty different because you want to make sure they feel nice and cozy and safe and all that.
Yeah.
But yeah, driving is a really good feeling, I think. If you've got a good road and a good car, some nice curves to it, it's really fun.
It's definitely a fun thing to do. It's not something I enjoy when in a city or in a traffic.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. That's not you in the road, that's you trying to not die when there are a bunch of people not paying attention to their surroundings. right, we got 44.
Yeah.
I'll do this one. Verse 44. One's own reputation. Why the fuss? One's own wealth. Why the concern? I say, what you gain is more trouble than what you lose. Love is the fruit of sacrifice. Wealth is the fruit of generosity. Be content. Rest in your own fullness. You will not suffer from loss. You'll avoid the snare of this world. You have a long life and endless blessing. So there was a rapper who once said, "Mo money, mo problems." Who said that? This was
It's a great way to summarize it.
Notorious Big, I think. Yeah, it's a single by Notorious Big. Yeah, but money involves a physical attachment to physical material wealth and objects, which oftentimes means you need to steward that, you need to protect that, you need to invest that. It's a burden and it's a weight, which does have value, but it's not inherently a universal positive, which I think a lot of society and culture shows money that way, where money is glamour, money is fame, money is power, and you think about those positives, and that's how it's pitched, to the point where people are really trying to push the envelope of, I need to earn 6 figures and then I need to earn more than that, I need to be a millionaire, and that kind of thing, as opposed to also seeing the negatives of how more money oftentimes increases your obligations. They've done some studies on how your income relates to your happiness, and I think there is a trend where happiness does increase to a certain point of income gain, but then it doesn't increase as much after that, and that has to do with management of debt and being able to afford just the basic things of living, such as house, healthcare, being able to look after your family, having a well-balanced diet, being able to afford vacations and things like that. So finding a good life balance and having some practical capital you can use to have a good living, as opposed to seeking money just on its own. Also, referring back to Revolver, they have this character called Mr. Gold, who is kind of figurative. They never show Mr. Gold, so I kind of see Mr. Gold as an idea of the pursuit of money, and how that character, he drives a lot of other people's decision making, where they think that they need to pursue more material wealth than actually benefits them. So taking a really good hard look at, who am I as a person? What do I want to accomplish? And what activities and experiences do I enjoy? Because you get pretty big diminishing returns on most things that you would use money for past a certain point. You've got a safe place to live. You've got access to what you need access to. You can survive and thrive and all that. So what is additional money for? It would need to have some point and purpose, rather than just, I need more gold coins and I want to sit on them like a dragon.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between having money as a means to something or having money as an end to itself. And having money as an end to itself is really problematic, because there's no amount of money that will ever be able to satisfy that. You'll be constantly chasing more money, because there's never going to be enough unless you have all of it, in which case you probably want to print more, because it's still, there could be more. And this is just the human mindset, that we want more out of life, we want more out of everything. But if you have money as a goal as itself, it's not something that can ever be satisfied. On the other hand, if you just want to make enough money to buy a house or to satisfy your basic needs, you can get a lot of happiness from making enough money to satisfy those needs. So if you have a particular goal in mind you want to reach, be it just making a good living or to buy a yacht or whatever it is you to own, is rewarding. But as soon as you have money as a goal by itself, it gets really problematic, and you're making yourself unhappy necessarily.
I wanted to address the first line of the verse as well. One's own reputation, why the fuss? The visual that this gives me is a person who's running or walking, and to be concerning your own reputation is kind of like watching your feet as you're taking steps, rather than watching the horizon of where you're trying to go as a person, but also having the balance of sometimes you do want to watch your step, especially if you're in a place where you could step into a hole or make some mistake and that kind of thing. So you should be flexible about it. You should be aware of your reputation, but you also shouldn't be constantly staring at your reputation as an endpoint, kind of like constantly pursuing money as an endpoint. Reputation is a consequence of action, but you also shouldn't be consumed by what your reputation is. I think this creates a lot of really nasty behavior when people are faced with criticism, is they'll want to be thought of well by every single person in the world, and anyone who says anything bad, they lash out and have this really strong reaction, rather than kind of understanding that if you stand for anything, you're going to have some enemies and people who stand against you. You can't possibly please everyone, so there's a point where you just need to find who you are as a person and reconcile with how that fits into the social strata and the community and all that.
Yeah, that's a really nice analogy with the walking on what we're looking at. For me, it goes into a lot of the concept of fear we're having and how different fears, but we experience them all the same. So basically, for us, fear, as it was historically, was fearing something like a wild animal that could eat us or another tribe attacking us. So there's this existential fear of getting killed, basically. And then there's also, and back then this was an existential fear too, was the fear of losing one's reputation, being getting kicked out of the social group you're living in because people don't like the shit you say or don't like the way you act. And this was a death sentence back in the day. And we're still treating losing one's reputation in the same way. We feel it as an existential threat, even though it really isn't anymore. We're just able to move to the next town and annoy the people there until they kick us out. And I think that's one of the big problems people are having to show up, be themselves in a capacity of public speaking, for example, where you get rid of the concerns you're having that someone might not like you for it and people are gonna kick you out of their community, because you ought to be a really terrible public speaker and say a lot of weird stuff for people to actually kick you out. And so we're treating these fears as if though they were existential, even though they're not anymore. And we're holding ourselves back a lot just by fearing that something bad could happen, which is true. There's always, if you go into a public forum and say something rather stupid, you will get reactions, but they will not kill you. And to standing up for what you believe to be right is an important thing to do, because first you might be right about it and teach it to other people, or you might be wrong about it and then other people can tell you why you're wrong.
This speaks to what my viola instructor told me when he was watching me perform different pieces that I was practicing. He was saying, sometimes you quiet down when you're playing because you don't want people to hear the mistake. But if you play quietly and I don't hear what the mistake is, then I can't correct it. So you should play consistently at your normal volume, and if you make a mistake, we'll adjust it, write it in your notes, and you can improve. So if you're whispering and muttering, then you're not making the mistakes that you need to gain the experience to improve. There's a really big point here, I think, regarding the fear of making mistakes and how wisdom comes from making mistakes a lot of the time. So if you're not applying yourself and taking those risks and gaining those experiences, then you can't gain the knowledge and wisdom you need to improve as a person. It's like living in a box or living in a bubble. You're never going to acquire the wisdom that you would if you went out in the world and tried different stuff and gained new experiences. Yes, you're going to fail. Yes, you're going to embarrass yourself and do certain things. I've certainly embarrassed myself a lot of times saying certain stuff, but that gave me knowledge about how to be tactful with my communication. And that tact wasn't just innate or a part of my nature. I had to make mistakes and be embarrassed and learn from that process to the point where you gain that sensitivity, that awareness of what's going on in that interaction.
Yeah, I think you quoted this as well, where the master has failed more times than the.
Than the novice has ever tried.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we're holding our back a lot by just being scared of failing, because there's a lot of beauty in failing, and you can fail rather graciously. And that we're scared of something bad happening to us because you do something wrong, but there's always something good in failing, and by being scared of it, you're holding yourself back. You're limiting yourself to the things you're already good at, whether or not that is true, or you just think that you're good at something is be the other question. But basically, that when we're scared of failing, we lose this sense of beauty in trying something new, and seeing the world unfolding as not something that needs to be mastered, but something that needs to be practiced, something that needs to be enjoyed along the way.
There was a fun conversation we had at the Twitch Ambassador Summit, and one of the people who was leading a seminar asked the room, what is the thing that you are best at as a broadcaster? And I applied that to myself, and I was thinking, okay, I'm not the best StarCraft player by a long shot. I'm not the biggest streamer by a long shot. And then I think I piped up maybe first or third or something like that, and I said losing gracefully. Losing gracefully is the thing that I'm best at, where I'm not the top GM, I'm not the best Zerg who's online at a lot of times of the 24-hour cycle, but being able to take a loss and not flip my table over, not talk crap about my opponent, it makes the process more smooth, and it sets an example for other people to where by losing, something is being gained for the community. There's a data point of, wow, this person just died to a cannon rush and they didn't take it too bad. Well, that's amazing. Does that mean that I don't need to rage and throw my hands in the air when I lose to a cannon rush? Maybe. It challenges that expectation that we had for a lot of esports culture and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff that can be gained through failure and loss.
Yeah, Nietzsche talks about this concept, the three transformations of the soul, and we'll definitely get into that a bit more in depth when we reach Nietzsche in the future. But he basically speaks about how we should be able to get back to this childlike mentality where we're able to laugh about ourselves, to just try something for the sake of trying and fail for the sake of failing, and not taking life all that seriously. And there's a lot of beauty in that, and being able to not taking yourself too serious and just doing something because you want to see how it feels. You want to watch yourself failing, and not thinking that will be some kind of existential threat to your being when you fail on a public stage, or even when no one else is listening or watching you.
Yeah, that made me think of an important part of comedy, which is being comfortable when you are being laughed at. And how, for a lot of people, that's a really scary situation. But if you can embrace that role, then it gives you a lot of room for play and for humor and for joy for yourself and other people. And also a sense of relaxation, of being okay, like doing some slapstick stuff, being a silly goose, jumping about, flailing your arms in a way that that picture wouldn't make it on the front of some modeling cover, but it's you in the moment being silly, and it's free, and it's natural movement of something that expresses an aspect of your experience. And for other people, that can be liberating to watch as well. If they see you being silly and not really taking yourself too seriously, it's more relaxing to watch than someone who is really fragile about how other people see them, and they're trying not to be too weird or too silly all the time. They're basically on these set tracks of society expects me to behave in these ways, and I don't want to go off course for that. I think Reggie Watts is an example of that in the way that he presents himself and the way that he organizes his comedy, where it directly goes off the rails and way outside the box in ways that is hilarious, because it offends all of those different expectations that you would expect from someone who's, say, doing stand-up comedy.
Yeah, I think this has a lot to do with vulnerability. My wife talks about this a lot, her being a coach, and how we need to be able to get rid of, or get comfortable rather, with vulnerability, and being open to getting stabbed, basically, in order to have real conversations, in order to have to show up as ourselves, in order to just to live a fulfilled life. You need to be able to be vulnerable, which is a rather difficult thing to do, especially in Western culture, where everyone seems to be fighting for themselves, and you need that constant suit of armor to protect yourself from everyone that's attacking you. So in order to be vulnerable in that context is a really difficult thing to do. But as we talked about before, the physical aspect of talking, that as a human, your most valuable, your most vulnerable part would be your belly. So getting punched there or stabbed there would most likely get you killed. So we tend to have this protective, like we have our arms in front of our belly to protect it, which is a fundamentally protective posture, rather than when you're standing upright and just having your arms somewhere where you're showing this kind of vulnerability to your audience and show, all right, I'm here, I don't see a need to protect myself from you, and I don't need to protect my belly from all your stabs, which sends out a whole different view to the listener, where you showing up vulnerable makes you a lot more powerful, which is a really interesting concept.
That makes me think of bluffing in the context of nature, and how bluffing, you see it happen all the time with different birds and animals that puff themselves up in some way to look intimidating, and how that oftentimes allows them to avoid a conflict that they might have otherwise had. And socially speaking, that's sort of a physiological and social trick to represent strength that ends up being self-reinforcing, where, like we talked about before, if you're standing tall, you feel taller and more confident in yourself, and then other people see that, and it's less awkward for them, and they tend to feed off of that confidence positively for themselves. So it's a reinforcing sort of loop, where if you are open, if you allow yourself to be vulnerable, it shows that confidence, rather than that you're trying to be defensive and you're scared of making mistakes and things like that. If you can make a mistake, I think recovery of mistakes is a really important life skill. As a musician, this is really easy to see, where oftentimes someone will make a mistake, but they play off of it in a way that to the audience it almost looks intended. Like maybe they meant to do that. They just do it so gracefully, they weave it into the fabric of what they're presenting, that it doesn't look bad at all. It could look amazing. That, wow, that I didn't expect that to happen, but they played it off really well. Or sometimes they just admit it, like they shrug their shoulders or make a face or something, and it's cute, and you enjoy that as a process rather than the fear of, what if I make a mistake and they see it, my career is ruined, all this. People can kind of see that energy that you give off just in the animal sense. You don't need to state that I'm scared of my reputation and other people seeing me mess up and that kind of thing. It shows with your sort of aura, you could say, just like confidence does.
Yeah. This is interesting again when we look at describes the sage and what it is to have this sagely aura where you don't to preach to people or to actively teach them, but just showing up with your aura and treating people good, treating people in a respectful manner will have that teaching moment for people more so than you telling them not to do one thing or the other.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that in our previous session where we're talking about your personal charisma and social aura, and where whenever you're moving through life and engaging with even people who you'll probably never run into again, just having them leave a little bit more positive and happy than when they first encountered you. It's kind of like having a plus to your morale that just floats around you as a sort of cloud, where someone interacts with you even just in the like cashier capacity, and you try to listen to them, you actually connect and you smile and you try to value them in the way that you engage, even if it's just for a few seconds or a minute, and how that can be a pretty big impact on someone's day. And every interaction creates those opportunities.
Yeah. I also think that most humans are more reactionary than actively trying to influence others. So, for example, and this is probably more so important in the US, when you interact with police, how you engage with them will determine the outcome of what will happen. So if you're just staying nice and friendly, you'll be a lot more likely to get let off the hook if what you did wasn't so bad than if you're already scared and maybe talking with them in an aggressive manner. It will change the conversation rather quickly. And this goes for all or most of human interaction, where you listen to the other person and how they're getting into the conversation and what kind of moods and feeling they're expressing with how they talk, and that will change you and how you react. So basically, if you go up to the cashier and your mood state is neutral basically, and she's having a bad day and she'll be stressed out, and you'll be a lot more likely to be rude to her and just not tipping her as much, for example, than when she would have a good day. And so we're a lot more reactionary, and we're really good at looking at the between the line context of what people say and how they say it, and then react to it.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, when you constantly try to show up as good as you can, you'll react people a lot more positively than you could ever imagine. That they read between those lines and they see how you feel, even though you're not realizing it, and they will react to it by treating you nicely as well. For the most part, it doesn't always work.
Sometimes, with the best side, I think that can be a little bit confusing for some, because sometimes the best presentation you can have for yourself is a true and real one that shows, to reference the vulnerability, your vulnerability for that day. So rather than putting on a fake smile, sometimes making light of a tough day, if someone asks you, like, how's your day been going? It's like, well, I've had a lot better days than this. And just putting it in that kind of capacity where they can kind of laugh and nod along with you, that can be good for both parties to vent and to kind of release some of that tension, rather than to have the artificial, I'm going to pretend to be happy for you in this moment to fake positivity. I think you can make light of adversity and difficulty in a way that allows you to process that and share it in a way that doesn't burden them. It is a kind of way of connecting with them in solidarity.
Yeah. Did you already switch the verse?
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking I didn't read that yet.
61.
A great state is like a river that receives everything flowing into. It is the place where all things come to rest, where all the world is welcomed. The low is greater than the high. The still is greater than the restless. The low country wins over its neighbor. The still female wins over the male. The sage wants to uplift the people. The people want to follow the sage. Only by being low does this come to be. The sage bows to the people bow to the sage. And when they lift up their heads, only greatness remains.
I have I think it's another Bible thing that's coming up. Talking about Christ, he came not to be served, but to serve. This sort of fits with the sage, where oftentimes the best leaders are the ones who are focusing on serving the people, as opposed to finding the power structures and getting those structures to serve them.
Yeah, that's when you lose heaven's mandate and Chinese, when you start serving yourself, not to serve the people. It's a really interesting conversation we can get into when we talk about Confucius. But important to know there that his ideas of how things should be and how things flow naturally are heavy influenced by Taoism. So when he talks here about the state being like this basin where everything comes to rest, it's where there's constant flow of things, but at some point everything gets together, making this oneness that can be still, that doesn't move, doesn't need to find a way to go even more down or to flow any direction. This would be the state where everyone just can come in and basically be themselves, and everything is taken care of to some degree. And I think a really nice thing that he points out here is this is where the whole world is welcomed. Kind of going about the notion of migration these days. And so basically he talked about a state should be attractive to people. If you have people wanting to come to your state and wanting to serve your state, that's the best thing you should aim for. And a good state is the state that can welcome those people with open arms, because you want to grow, you want to make it basically make everything one state in order for everything to be harmonious. So that be the notion of the big state being like the ocean, where just everything runs together and is at peace.
Yeah, the aspect of this, so talking about the still female wins over the male, and how a lot of times romance is not something that needs to necessarily be pursued. Oftentimes it is a product of representing the attributes that someone would be looking for and just being yourself. So rather than necessarily being in a seeking sort of mode, just being yourself in your natural movement and rhythm, and other people being attracted to that aspect of who you are rather than inherently the chase process.
Yeah, I think we have exceptionally good. We not necessarily see what the person is trying to hide or how they are really, but we see when someone is not themselves, basically. It puts us off to some degree, and it makes us distrust the person. And this is happens on a really instinctive level. So you'll be a lot more likely and a lot more open to good conversation where you just show up as yourself and try not to hide anything. Again, going back to the notion of vulnerability, then when you're just trying to represent something, representing an idea or representing a characteristic of yourself.
Yeah, and there's another kind of side attachment to this, which is the process of dating, and how a lot of people think of a date as an event, and how oftentimes stating an interaction as a date as that type of event, it adds a certain sort of pressure to it that makes it less enjoyable for the parties involved, rather than just two people who want to share some time together. And if there happens to be chemistry, then a romantic plotline can develop from that. But it doesn't necessarily need to be, hey, do you want to go on a date to this at this place? Rather, it is, would you like to have a meal and some conversation at this place? And if that develops, then we'll let that happen organically. But I'm not initiating this social interaction with the expectation that we are now dating. I think that adds a lot of worry and fear and anxiety and things like that for people, where they're unsure of if they want to lead someone on and this and that. Just be real. Just be yourself. Have a conversation. Don't be in a hurry. And a lot of times that stillness in yourself, where you're not chasing, you're not reaching for someone, you're just relaxed and comfortable and confident and also vulnerable as you are, then that represents yourself much better.
Yeah, totally agree with that. There's an interesting distinction. Don't want to say I learned recently, but to basically think of them as two separate ways of approaching things was interesting for me. Basically, because of this talk I'm doing now, or also other activities I'm engaging, where it is about showing up vulnerably. So the distinction is between presence and performance. And when I prepare for a talk like this, I look at all the sources. I think about what is, in my opinion, important to talk about, what I really want get into. Also, other things that I feel like, all right, this could be something we could be talking about. But I tend to, and this was like the mode I used to do most of my things. I had the tendency to really think through how I wanted to say things, because especially since this is in English and not in German, it takes me a bit more effort to come up with a good way of phrasing something. So I wanted to have like every sentence prepared and be sure to know what I'm saying, which is the totally wrong way to approach it. Because first off, you'll definitely get all the phrasings wrong you have prepared, so you're not able to prepare to the point where you're able to say all those things you prepared for. And then I wouldn't be able to listen to what you're saying and to the things you're saying, but I'd constantly be thinking of, what do I want to say next, and how did I put that, and do I need to go back into my notes to read how to say it. So by basically destroying my notes before I give any kind of speech or talk, just having a couple of words written down to know, all right, will be the next topic, and then we'll go to that topic. To have a basic structure is important for me, because otherwise we just get lost somewhere and be talking about Nietzsche most of the time, just because that'd be fine for me. And yeah, but basically by burning my notes beforehand, not literally but figuratively, I'm able to focus on the performance, the presence I'm having in a conversation, rather than the performance I'm about to give. So that was a really valuable distinction for me, and how to look at any kind of public engagement, or any kind of basically any kind of interaction. that you want to be present. You don't want to be perform a act that you learned beforehand, because that will always look weird to the other person.
Well, it would be very mechanical and robotic if you were just writing out every word you're going to say and just reciting all of that. You might as well have just typed it out and then posted it somewhere at that point.
Yeah.
Versus a conversation where we have some feedback in the chat, you have feedback from me, and we're taking different tangents, different routes to tackle this stuff, different analogies that come up that we couldn't have thought of all of this stuff ahead of time. And it would be less fun, I think, if it wasn't a living, breathing conversation. That's, I think, the most important thing to remember for a lot of these documents that were written. Many of them were written with the intention that they should be living documents, where it's not just these are the words, these are the sacred words, these are the perfect words, you must always recite them in this order, in this manner, versus this is a set of ideas that are meant to be taken and then picked up and examined, digested, adjusted to the person who's considering them in the moment. I think the Constitution of the United States is meant to be something like that, where it's supposed to be adjusted and this kind of thing moving forward, so it fits the country in question for the current era, not just for when it was written initially, because things change over time. The use of a text in the process of learning and interpreting it should also change to fit the reader or the listener.
Yeah, totally.
There's a Bruce Lee. It's like a finger that points to the moon. Don't look at the finger, or you'll miss all the heavenly glory.
Nice. Yeah, that's also how the books we talked about last time, Plato and Aristotle, most of them are written in dialogue, where it's not meant to be just one person saying all that stuff and he's the guideline basically, but rather just, all right, here are some ideas. Let's talk about it. Let's look at it from different perspectives. And Confucius famously said that if he holds up 3 corners of a problem, he doesn't want a student that is not able to return with the 4th part of that problem. So not just looking at something, especially a text like the Tao Te Ching, and be like, all right, this is how we live our life, and this is how things should be, and now everyone is going out looking for a still female. I think we're doing something wrong. But rather just engaging and talking about the things that are written, and taking them as probably good ideas, since we're still having them around 2,500 years after they were first written down, and that they have a good influence for the most part. But not taking them as this heavenly guideline that will tell us everything we ought to know about the world.
Do you experience depression and anxiety? Read this document and all your problems will go away. Wow. It's that easy, huh? Nope, it's not. Too bad.
Now, I think this goes back to the notion of us wanting easy solutions to everything. Just, I have this problem. Okay, I take this pill and it will be solved. I want to have more of that, so I buy this thing that is not at all related to the feeling. And it's just this reward seeking we're having, and how to solve everything in the laziest way possible is really how we're set up to do things nowadays, and it's hurting us in the long run, in my opinion. But it's really the mode we're thinking in, for the most part, that there is this problem and there's one easy way to fix it, so we do that and then everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also something I'm doing a good amount of times, and my wife constantly reminds me that when she tells me something that's bothering her, that she doesn't want me to solve a problem, she just wants someone to listen. Because I will not be able to solve the problem, but as long as she has someone that listens to her and basically makes her feel heard and valued, that's good enough for her, and it's a lot better than me coming up with solutions that are not at all what she was looking for.
Yeah, it can help people process what's going on as well, even if you don't necessarily point them in a direction. Just by allowing them to articulate their feelings and their thoughts, it lets them vent, and also sometimes it can help them lead to the correct answer, if there is one. But yeah, I've said, with regards to some people saying you should coach this person and that person, that the best help is going to come from within, especially if it involves their quest directly. If they actually really want to change, that needs to be self-motivated rather than someone else trying to drive them in a direction. If they don't want it, then they're not going to pursue it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing about coaching, where it's not having someone tell you what to do, but having someone helping you along the way of making realization of what to do. And I had this conversation with my coach, and he basically we talked a bit about philosophy. He was like, "Well, all those ancient philosophers, they were basically coaches." I was like, "Yeah, that's kind of true. They didn't try to put you into a direction, but they just opened your thoughts to new possibilities, and that's basically what coaching is for, in a more abstract sense than coaching StarCraft, for example. Whereas it's just about having someone to help you along the way of how you could do things differently without pointing you towards this is what you need to do.
Yeah, the best teaching and coaching, I think, is directly built upon the student and what the student wants. So one of the first questions that I like to ask whenever I'm beginning a session is, what is your plan? How do you want to play this matchup? Because oftentimes there are multiple valid solutions to a matchup, and a coach can help them move in the direction of polishing or refining any given one, but it's a bit presumptuous, I think, for the coach to say, this is the method, you follow the method, do this thing. And then the student doesn't really learn how to think for themselves or understand the why of what's going on. They're just basically copying the what, and they're conforming to your method rather than being able to create their own method and their own mode of self-expression that is guided in some way by your insight.
Yeah. I think you can agree that it gets a lot as a coach if you have someone that wants to just enjoy playing StarCraft more so than someone that wants to master a Zergling rush.
Mm-hmm.
So the more abstract the thing they want to get out of it is, the more difficult it gets to coaching something. But basically, the Tao Te Ching, I think, is great in teaching us not to worry about what will happen as much and just enjoying the ride of being alive.
Yeah, embracing what is.
Exactly.
You don't have to like what is all the time, but embracing it is a really good step to being able to relax in the moment as much as you can and just be. Trust your instincts, do what you gotta do. So we got verse 81 is the last one. It's my turn. Words born of the mind are not true. True words are not born of the mind. Those who have virtue do not look for faults. Those who look for faults have no virtue. Those who come to know it do not rely on learning. Those who rely on learning do not come to know it. This makes me think perfect is the enemy of the good. Which is Voltaire, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of times people are constantly in the critic mindset of what are all the flaws of what happened rather than enjoying the process. I think using StarCraft again as an example, some people don't allow themselves to enjoy a match until that would be impressive to someone, which I think is really problematic because there's always someone who's higher than you who might see that as a very flawed and messy performance with a lot of bad stuff going on, and they would not be impressed. but being able to represent who you are, what you can do in a match that was fun and interesting, and being proud of that, whether you're bronze league or gold or master or whatever, is really important because your play is never going to be perfect. So when are you going to allow yourself to enjoy it? You
I
might
think
as well
it's
from the beginning.
It's again the same distinction between presence and performance, where if you start up a match, you have this specific build order in mind, and execute that build order would be a task of performing something. You're not present to the game itself, and it will be a lot less likely that you enjoy it, even though you win at the end of a 6 pool, 12 pool nowadays.
Yeah, and there's another point here in this final set. Those who rely on learning do not come to know it. There was a comment that comes up a lot. Whenever I'll talk about anything, oftentimes there's someone who's either an expert or they have a degree in something, and there will be a question like, what are your qualifications to be able to talk about this thing? And that it kind of also goes with the example of when are you allowed to have a conversation? When are you allowed to enjoy what's going on? You can't be an expert in everything. Even to focus on one track, say I took my neuroscience path where I got my bachelor's, I get into a PhD program, I get my PhD, I get a specialization, and I'm trying to study one particular thing about the brain. I could be an expert in that one thing, and I could talk about that with some authority if I wanted to. But maybe I'm also interested in just having a conversation about biology or some field that's neighboring to that or even far from that, like astronomy. I can say words about that, and I can apply what I've learned about inquiry, discovery, testing, critical thinking, and try to get closer to the answer. I'm not going to claim to the world that I know how things are, but being able to train your mind to think critically and to process things with your own intuition is its own process that you learn. And I think that's the most important thing about learning and, say, getting an education. I feel like if you got a degree and you didn't really understand the point that your university experience was more to learn how to learn rather than to get that degree, you kind of missed the main point. Because I have a cognitive science degree, and there was someone who was hassling me in the chat saying that I should have got a communications degree instead. And I was like, but I wouldn't be neuro if I got a communications degree. Neuro as part of the brain, it's who I am, and I learned not just about the brain, but about mindset, cognitive bias, things like that, and that's all woven into who I am. So you should think about your educational background, what you've learned, how that shaped you as a person, and how you can use that as a set of tools to understand your surroundings, try your best, and adjust to new information that comes in. Not like a measuring contest of, who's got the longer degree here? Well, you have 2 master's degrees, I only have 1 master's degree. I guess you're right about everything. I'll just back up here.
I think it also has to do with showing up vulnerable, like not presenting yourself basically knowing everything, but rather being, all right, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and talk about something I'm not an expert in. But this is something that people, due to the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, are not as able to do. So they tend to judge that in other people, where they just have this childish notion of trying something new and possibly failing along the way, where they see that as a weakness, which I think it is the totally wrong way of looking at it. It's something that makes you strong because you're able to grow through more experience, through trying new things and failing along the way without making it without failing, the process of failing stopping you or holding you back, but it being a process of getting better or realizing that some things just aren't for you. which is a good experience as well, where you realize, well, synchronized swimming is not the sport that I'll ever enjoy. Haven't tried it though. to be completely honest, I have a hunch. So
there's a memory that I have that really opened my mind to a lot of how conversation and discussion works for the process of learning and teaching. There are two friends that I had in university, and between the three of us, we all kind of would fall at a similar point in the IQ scale, grades pretty similar and all that. And there was a certain competitive attitude with one of my friends, and he was competing with this other guy constantly about who is smarter between the two of us. And whenever they would have a conversation, it was like his integrity, his reputation, and his intellect were on the line, and he was trying to beat this other guy to who could be smarter. And I'm seeing this unfold, and the guy who's more relaxed has the upper hand all the time because he's just wanting to listen to what this other guy has to say. Like, what are you so hyped up about? Like, tell me about this. What's going on? And he would be measured. He would be slower with taking in information and thinking about what he was going to say. And it really frustrated this snappy guy who's trying to be the smarter one of the two. I need to be smarter than you. I need to beat you in this argument, this discussion, which I think inherently puts you at a disadvantage, especially if you're trying to be smarter over time, you want to see what the other people in the room know and learn about that. You want to learn what they know by asking them questions, which inherently means that sometimes you are the student to their teacher. So the student-teacher relationship is another dynamic that you can train and improve upon, where, to quote Bill Nye, everyone you meet knows something you don't. So you shouldn't walk around posturing like, I'm this decorated academic and intellect, all should bow before my awesomeness. That's really disgusting. It puts off a really nasty air when people are talking to you, because they can kind of tell that you've got something to prove and you want to make sure that everyone knows how smart you are. As opposed to, if you were truly on the quest for knowledge, then you would want to hear other people's perspective. You want to know their reasons behind what they think, the experience they had that shaped that perspective. You want to know the what and the why, because at the end of the conversation, you will have gained nothing if you're only talking about yourself the entire time.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I think that when you're I see that a lot in basically the debate formats that started YouTube, Twitch as well, where you have two people from opposing views trying to punch each other with statistical facts and just talking past each other for 90% of the conversation, not agreeing on the terms and the setup of the conversation, where it's, to some degree, it's fun to listen to them, how they basically are talking about two different things. But also it's not like neither of them is going to learn something from that debate. So I think it's a play to some degree where you have two people fighting like a wrestling match, but neither of them will be a better fighter afterwards.
I will say there is quite a bit of benefit to the debate format for the audience, though. A lot of my perspectives were shifted pretty dramatically by watching debates when I, as the viewer, had a kind of curious mind, and I ended up favoring the person of the opposing side because their argument was better. So in the ideal case, we're not talking about the actual ways that a lot of people will do a quote debate, which, like you're saying, is talking past each other. But if you can start from the ground level where you agree upon the premises, you have a good moderator, who is, I think, a really important role for a debate that is missing a lot of the time. You have a good moderator who's handling the questions, giving people proper time. The audience then is the thing that changes the most at the end of the debate, because most times the two people who are on either side of the debate are going to be very entrenched in their views, And the actual shift happens for the fence sitters, the people who are kind of in the middle. They're not super committed to either side, and they can listen with more neutral ears. And you can practice this just in your own mind, I think, when maybe you are entrenched on one side, but an exercise that helps me is I'll say, okay, taking the case that this side is correct, the opposing side of mine is correct, this is their logic, and if you kind of build up that, I think of it as like a castle or a structure of information in your own mind, and it ends up making sense, then you can sometimes change your perspective on a really big issue. It's challenging to do, but I think it can be refreshing. Even if you don't change your perspective every time, you do need to kind of be informed by your own experience, but being able to entertain their line of thinking as an exercise can help you understand them a lot better.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And the difference between a formal debate with people have it everything set out so you can talk about something specific and really go in depth about can't come up with a good example, but basically you have all the premises set up to the point where they just have to debate about the meaning of a specific word in a text, for example, and they can present their opposing views. That's super interesting for the viewer. But I think that the debate where it's just two people that have views that are so opposing that they can't even agree on the thing they're actually talking about is just like a blood sport where you want to see as much blood as possible and you want to see your side winning.
Yeah,
and that's not necessarily good form of conversation.
Yeah, that's more of like the people who are going to a race to see a car crash rather than to see the best driver.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's the second part to number 82. Do you want to do that or should I?
Oh, to 81. Oops, I missed that. I didn't scroll down enough. The sage sees the world as an expression of his own self. So what need has he to accumulate things? By giving to others, he gains more and more. By serving others, he receives everything. Heaven gives, and all things turn out for the best. The sage lives, and all things go as Tao goes. All things move as the wind blows. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of reward in giving. I had heard, I think one of the first examples that I learned of this was Dad buying presents for my brother and I, and how oftentimes if it's Christmas or something, or Easter, those were the main holidays where we would open presents and stuff, we would have a much bigger stack of presents than him. And he makes the money, he wins the bread of the family. And he would have oftentimes the smallest stack of presents. And it's like, why do you do this? And he says, I have more joy in seeing you enjoy new things and getting what you want rather than me getting things for myself. And that's, I think, a really important aspect of society and civilization functioning is freedom to give, understanding what you have and how, if you have disposable income, or even not income, but you can create something for someone else, how valuable that is, and how it's not about the race of who can accumulate more total riches in their life, but who can give to others as a gesture and also just to express love and appreciation for other people. It tends to kind of circulate amongst the community as well, because if a certain person is establishing a habit of giving, then that sets the tone for the community. And if I can brag about the StarCraft community, we have a very good culture of hosting each other, where we're not afraid that if I host this stream, I'm going to lose a bunch of my viewers because they're going to go to this channel instead. It's just saying, I'm going to help you because I can help you, and because I want you to succeed because you're a member of the community. And because they've been hosted a bunch, they end up hosting other people because it's tradition. It's what we tend to do. So yeah, giving is definitely important and good, and I think oftentimes it's self-reinforcing, where the more you give, the more others give to others.
Yeah, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy when you, famous as people being reactionary in a conversation. It's you by giving, also just giving a nice gesture or being nice to someone, they receive something that's much more than just you being nice. They might get a good feeling out of it and be nice to the next person and just so on. And it really has a self enforcing mechanism that is really nice. But also the same is true about treating someone badly, which will make them like the concept of tit for tat, where you're being reactionary to being treated good or bad, and basically acting good or bad in return to it. So if we're constantly trying to be good, we'll do a lot more good. And if we fail, which we will always fail at everything we do, basically, not to the same degree. But if we fail, we can enjoy the failing, but constantly try to improve upon what we're doing and how we're doing it. Will bring a lot more good into the world than we do bad.
Yeah, this made me think of a point of awareness where there's a lot of negativity that floats around in life, and oftentimes it's natural to be the recipient of some negativity, and then for that to be flowing through you into someone else in your life, and how the more powerful move for you and the better move is to notice that negativity coming in, to acknowledge it and say, this is affecting me, but also to let it end with you, where you don't let that seep into some other conversation where someone lashed out at you, so you lash out at someone else. Someone lashes out at you, and you try to process that in a way that is healthy, where you can digest it and move through it, but also not in a way where you just reflect it off of someone else in your life. Oftentimes this happens to loved ones and the people you live with, which aren't the people who deserve it, but you've been taking a bunch of heat from the world, and then you get home and then you just that onto your housemates or your family, which is really bad.
Yeah, I think that's really common, that we treat the people that we love most, closest to us, that we treat those the worst. And it's definitely not a good way to approach things, but it's fundamentally human, I guess, that we're trying to keep this image of ourselves as flawed beings as much out of the public eye as possible. So we keep this private and only fail on a small scale, which is to be shitty to your spouse or to your parents, which is basically failing on a much bigger scale, because you're ruining your most fundamental relationships. So it's a weird thing we do, but it's not for our benefit, in my opinion.
The part of the rationale for me engaging with trolls and people who upset me in the chat is so that I understand exactly where the negativity is coming from and I can address it at its source, rather than to just absorb that into myself and not be aware of where it was coming from, and then let that kind of poison other aspects of my day, where at the end of it I feel kind of nasty. But personally, I feel like if I address it and I understand where it's coming from and I try to do something about it, then it tends to process a lot better for me. Another one is being vulnerable with my stream and my chat. So if I'm tilted by something, saying that that was really frustrating, that helps me more than putting on the facade that I'm Neuro, the invincible, the dauntless, who is never upset by anything. I get upset a lot, and there are a lot of people who can push my buttons in the chat and piss me off. It's not really hard to piss me off, but if I pretend that they're not upsetting me, but they actually are, that's me being dishonest, and also I think setting an example of dishonesty, that I am above emotion, which is false. I experience lots of emotion. It's about how you manage that situation. And sometimes being confrontational can be the correct route there, where you don't just sit back and let all of that negativity happen, sometimes doing the courageous thing is standing up to negativity and trying to reason with someone and change a situation. Hero
Yeah,
versus
that's
villain is a dynamic that I think is useful. It would be nice if everyone would change and had a chance to do the right thing and move over to the right side and stuff, but kind of going back to the entrenched positions, sometimes someone is actively working against you in such a broad-based capacity that you're not going to be able to help them or shift their perspective, and it becomes being able to set a line for yourself of, I will only put up with your shit up to this point, and then we're done here because you're wasting my time, kind of a thing. And you're also setting a bad example and ruining my chat.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult line to walk where you want to be as nice as possible, but also set boundaries. But yeah, it's about vulnerability and showing up as yourself and talking about when you're pissed off, but also when you find it funny when some troll comes into chat and says something so utterly stupid that you can't take them seriously.
Yeah.
But basically, by showing up as yourself and addressing what it is that that you don't agree with is the best way. Like basically, all of interaction is communication, and there's this fun quote that the biggest misconception about communication is that it has happened. So, but basically, we think we use our words to express something that we feel or disagree with, and it resonated with the other person, which it really didn't. So communication skills are something that are really difficult to master, and to have a good conversation even with people you're close to is a difficult thing to do, and it's not something that we should take for granted that the other person understands what we were trying to say, but rather just constantly explore it and keep the conversation going and keep talking about how we feel about things or how we perceive things in a vulnerable way in order to further understanding between each other.
Mm-hmm. Gotta make sure you're on the same page as the people you're talking to. Well, cool. We covered a good bit of ground. I really like this format. I think with the visual aids, it helps a lot. Just to...
Yeah, I'll try to keep those up. So I have one more story to wrap everything up, and it's another small story similar to the one with the ox. And probably best if you go to your beautiful boat scene because we're talking about boats.
I'm on a boat. Got him.
So, you can show that one as well. I was thinking about the boat scene you're having, Caribbean.
Oh, my boat scene.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. We can do this.
So the story goes as follows. There's this fisherman on his boat trying to cross a river. And it's a stormy day, so there's a lot of waves on the river, and it's really difficult to cross. And as he goes, tries to cross to the other side, there's another fisherman that they need to cross basically, and he sees that the other man is coming towards him, and the boats are about to collide. And he starts yelling at the other fisherman, trying to get him to steer his boat in another direction, and making it so that they don't crash into each other. And of course they fail, they crash into each other, and yeah, that's the moral of the story is that imagine if that other boat, there's no one in it. There's no point in shouting at the other boatman, at the other fishermen because there's no one in it. You might as well still crash into the other boat, but there's no point yelling at them. There's no point getting yourself rallied up about what's about to happen. It will happen or it will not happen, but there's no way of steering it in the right direction. And that's basically the lesson of the Tao Te Ching, is to empty out your own boat, to live life floating down the stream and not trying to yell at other people in other boats, making them to steer any direction, because you might collide, you might not collide. There's no way of changing that. So empty your own boat and flow down the river of. That's the lesson of the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, I thought about this in the context of having conversations with people who are committed to positions that you don't agree with, and how over the course of a dinner, you're not going to change their mind on that. So it is kind of like passing ships. You can shout at their ship all you want, but you're not going to change the direction of it in that capacity. But sometimes you can find some common ground, or you can find some subset of their ideology that you think they might be open to changing or adjusting, and how that can be a pretty important step as well, where you're not trying to, quote, beat them in a discussion or an argument and shift the entire foundation of their thought process, but you just have a conversation, you see where it goes, you try to really listen to their experience, you try to be relaxed with who you are, because that makes you more pleasant to be around, and just represent yourself honestly and truthfully, and also try to, in good faith, understand where they're coming from and their perspective.
Yeah, I love to explore people that have feel about the world differently than I do. I love to explore where those beliefs are coming from while they having them, and I tend not to try to push them in any direction anymore, because that's really uncomfortable for the most part, and it's not rewarding, even though I managed to get someone to agree with me on some level that doesn't change any of their views, just for me to get a sense of winning the conversation. But it's really interesting for me to explore why someone believes a thing they believe, and to getting an understanding of why and how that is.
Well, the guy who basically paid my rent and everything and believed in me for building the stream, the way that he would approach conversation, especially persuasion, would involve first going for a really deep and comprehensive understanding of the person's views. So instead of saying, I'm right, or I'm right, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong, and this is why I'm right, he would do a really detailed and thorough inquiry of their perspective in a neutral way, where he didn't come across as aggressive. It was like, no, I really want to know what you think. Like, what do you think about this? And he would sort of lead them along in their own knowledge base, to the point where sometimes they arrive at a point where they're actually ignorant, and they didn't know they were ignorant until he was listening to them through that process, and they realized it. And that, for me, was one of the biggest motivators when I was moving away from my religion. Was I had lots of conversations with him where we're just talking about what I think about stuff, and we would get into a position where I would realize, well, I don't really understand why I hold this stance. I just do. I was told to. And I realized that I'm not standing on very firm ground. He didn't say, you're wrong and this is why, and I'm right and this is why. He said, okay, well, tell me about what you think. And if I really want to understand what's going on in the world, I'm going to be critical of not just other people's thoughts and opinions, but also my own.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. For the most part, we have those beliefs and subsets of beliefs that were born into, or were taught when we were young, that we don't really question. So what I found when I talked especially about politics with people that I don't agree with, is that they have some fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality, or the nature of the human experience that I don't agree with, which isn't to say that they're wrong about them. It's just something that I see differently, and there's no objective right or wrong about how these things should be or should be.
Yeah, I think
How
to an extent, there's often a better answer and a worse answer to certain things, but you can't always demonstrate that in a convincing way that's going to shift their perspective. So, hearing other people's subjective opinions certainly has a ton of value, but I guess this is kind of a personal perspective thing. And I think this was described as being a positivist, which is believing that there is an objective reality that we share that can be measured, which means that some answers are more correct than other answers, closer to the truth, quote. But that the pursuit of truth is an active process where oftentimes you can have the best answer for your experience so far that you believe to be the most true answer, but if you acquired more knowledge and experience, you would realize that you were wrong all along, which is really tough to be able to manage. And this, I think, ties in with the way. The way is that process of flowing down the river, not always confident that you're going the right way, but you're going and just trying to enjoy the journey.
Yeah, enjoy the ride while everything is going downhill.
Yep, embrace what is. This applied to when Kukio passed. I was talking with Miss Spite, and I was talking about the grief that I was experiencing, and she said that you should embrace the grief because it's not going to feel like this for the rest of your life. These are important emotions that are helping you process what's happening. It's not that you should be ashamed of grief or you should avoid the negative emotions you're feeling. They're part of this journey, so you should be present through those.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I think we tend to, as I was saying about the peaks of good or bad, or of happy or sad, that if we're taking off one side of the equation, we're also taking away from the other side. So if you're less able to be sad about something, you're also less able to be happy about something. This is something I have been doing for a time, where I just try to numb down negativity, but it also numbed down being happy about anything. And just it's a quote unquote good thing to be sad, because it makes you able to appreciate the good things as well.
Yeah, it's the vibrance of life.
Exactly.
Well, cool. I think this was a good amount of time. What is this, like 2 hours 40 or so, give or take?
Yeah, I think that the amount of time it takes kind of depends on how much I have to say about someone, and how much we're kind of engaging in just casual conversation in between. So I think I'll prepare like 1.5 hours of material to just be running through, and then we see where it takes us. But I think setting on a specific amount of time would be counterproductive. Same as when you go for a walk and say you just want to go for this short walk and be back in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
But then
definitely.
it's better you just go out and think for yourself, well, I'll be back when I'll be back, and hopefully learn something on the way.
Yeah, well, I think that it kind of fits with the best conversations that you can have are the ones that you don't plan to go long. You're just talking with someone about something, and then the night goes by and the sun comes up and you're like, whoa. I've had some of those happen before. But yeah, I like this. It's less scripted of, we're going to start at this time and then we're going to end at this time. That gives an extra pressure that I don't think helps anyone.
Yeah, I think that it's also that going out for just one drink can be a lot more dangerous than intentionally going out to get drunk, because then you're kind of open to just spending the rest of the night talking about stuff and drinking way too much. So the lower the expectations, probably the better the results are.
The sound is so much better this time as well.
That's awesome.
You have a nice voice, and I couldn't really tell in the previous setup.
Thank you. So we could just briefly talk about what I could be talking about next. And there's a bunch of different ideas that
Sure.
we already had. So talking about Confucius would be something that I would really enjoy, or Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and Buddhism would be an interesting conversation. Epicurus, that I already mentioned, would be a nice talk. Or going into the medieval times of philosophy, where it's this constant battle between religion and philosophy, and some people trying to prove that God existed while other people trying to disprove that God existed, which is a fun topic in and of itself.
I think that would resonate with a lot of what I investigated personally, because my quest when I was in my teens and going to university, I met with a lot of people in the sciences who stood opposed to Christianity, and I enjoyed people on both sides of it, so I just wanted to find the truth and that kind of thing. So there's a lot through that process that I think would line up with my own quest that I've had so far. But I did see a lot of interest in Buddha as well. And I think with this being also your investment in time and preparation and stuff, you can choose sometimes too, and I think that would be fun too. Because if you're really excited and interested in the content, then I think that adds to it as well. I don't think you should feel chained to, all right, now the chats are making me do this.
Well, I only give you things that I find interesting enough to talk about it. For example, I won't ever be giving you the option of me talking about Heidegger, because I'm just not going to do it. But yeah, but basically, I'm fine with any of these being chosen, and I think it's interesting also to kind of see what chat wants, and then I'll be bringing up other topics as we go along to kind of make it somewhat of a directed course of how we're going through these things, where we're not just jumping from one thing to another and it's totally random. So I think we're going through time for the most part, and kind of developing these ideas. So we started with the founders of Western philosophy last time, and now we have the founder of Eastern philosophy to some degree in Taoism, and we're able to build on that and go deeper into specific topics and specific ideas.
I think for the sake of completeness, hitting Confucius and Buddha next would probably be the most logical and organized, where people can, since we're talking to Twitch rather than to a person who's seasoned in the ways of philosophy, it makes sense to kind of build some of these structures where if they get caught up, they can get more of the big picture as opposed to just a bunch of different slices of different things.
Yeah, I think that too. And then there's two more things that I wrote down, one of which would be to do kind of a ethics 101, where we're not going deep into what people believed and how they argued for how we think about ethics and how we think being good or right, and how it, for most part, impossible to distinguish right from wrong, even though we have really strong feelings about it, and how that debate kind of rolled out over the years. Interesting topic, but maybe something that we should only touch on when we already have some of the fundamental ideas that kind of go into it.
Mm.
And the last thing would be to do some video game related philosophy. what came up for me is you talked about wanting to play Nier Automata, which is really heavy when it comes to philosophical themes, and just to pick some ideas out of that and talk about them could be something. Not too well versed on StarCraft lore, but there's definitely some good philosophical stuff in there, like basically the three different ideologies of Protoss, Zerg, and Terrans, and how these play out against each other would be something interesting to explore. And something I've been interested in since it just came out is NO 1800, which is this
I saw Loco playing that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting game that I used to play when I was a let's say 20 years ago when I started playing computer games. And it'd be a nice setup to kind of talk about different ideas about the economy and setting up government and that kind of stuff. So that could be something we can explore at some point. But I also feel that's something that we might want to push down a little bit further, since there's a lot of innate ideas that we probably should cover first to be able to talk about these things.
Yeah, I think by hitting the older philosophers first, that's laying more of the groundwork that allows us to hit stuff where if people have listened through multiple of these, they have more of the basic structure and context for what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool. Sounds fun. We can probably hit up another poll just to get a sense of the level of interest, but ultimately I would leave it up to you for which one we dive into based on the results.
No, I think we'll make it as easy as possible. Buddha and Epicurus.
Mm-hmm.
So to see what direction people want to hear about next, and then I'm confident to speak about all of these, and kind of we're not breaking with the tradition of going down the timeline, but we're taking different approaches to it.
Cool. Well, that sounds fun.
All right.
If anyone only caught part of this, this will go on YouTube. And this is the second episode. We have the first one up there already, which is helping me to destroy my YouTube channel, Kappa. But I very much value your time. This is a lot of fun for me as well. So thank you, Echifatum, for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Cool.
When that will be. I'm not sure on how busy I'll be the next couple of days, weeks. But I think a 2-week period is the longest I'll have to make you wait for the next one.
Sure. Well, we'll just we'll do some wu wei with it, just some natural movement. I'm not gonna force things.
All right, perfect.
Cool. Well, take care, Echifatum. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Nice. I'm on a boat.